The summer of 1886 arrived in the Red Kestrel Basin not with a gentle warmth, but as a hammer blow of heat and silence. The wind that scoured the valley floor was a dry, rasping thing, carrying the scent of baked earth and distant sage. It lifted the fine red dust from the parched land and painted it across everything, a constant, gritty film that settled on the split-rail fences of Creed Hollow Ranch like a second skin. The sun, a merciless white disk in a bleached blue sky, beat down on the landscape, draining the color from the sparse grass and making the distant mesas shimmer as if they were dreams of mountains rather than solid rock. At the heart of this sun-beaten stillness stood Eli Creed. He was perched precariously at the top of his windmill tower, a lean, sinewy figure outlined against the vast, empty sky. He worked with a slow, deliberate economy of movement, his hands sure and calloused as he methodically replaced a frayed leather belt on the fantail assembly. There was no wasted motion, no flicker of impatience. It was the practiced rhythm of a man who knew his work so well it had become a part of his bones. But his eyes, the color of faded denim, were hollowed out, staring at the worn leather and the shining steel as if looking through them into a vast and desolate distance. They were the eyes of a man who hadn't truly slept in months, haunted by nights that were too long, too quiet, and filled with the ghost of a presence that was no longer there. His wife, Martha, had been taken by the fever 2 winters past, and while the ranch work filled his days, it could not fill the echoing emptiness of his nights. The windmill, its blade still and silent, felt like a monument to his own stalled life. It was broken, and he would fix it, because that was what he did. He fixed things that were broken, all except the one thing that mattered most. Miles away, where the heat rose in visible waves from the dusty main street, the Silver Spur Crossing stagecoach station was an oasis of tired noise in the profound silence of the basin. The stage, a lumbering beast of wood and leather, pulled to a halt in a cloud of its own dust, the horses snorting and stamping, their hides slick with sweat. From its dark interior, a woman descended. Her name was Ada Linley. She was not dressed in the fine silks or delicate fabrics of the ladies who sometimes passed through on their way to more civilized locales. Her dress was of a sturdy, practical homespun, the color of dust itself, and her boots were scuffed and worn. She carried a single, small trunk, its leather corners battered from a long journey. But it was her face that commanded attention. It was a face built of strong lines, with a square jaw and eyes the color of moss after a rain. There was no softness in them, only a hardened, unyielding resolve. She moved with a purpose that set her apart from the other weary travelers, her gaze sweeping the small settlement, assessing, cataloging, missing nothing. In one hand, she clutched a rolled-up oilcloth packet. Inside was a meticulously hand-drawn map, its surface covered in a web of fine blue lines and cryptic notations that charted the hidden underground arteries of the Red Kestrel Basin, the aquifers and secret springs that were the land's lifeblood. Tucked within the map's folds was a fragment of a letter, the paper brittle and torn. The handwriting was her brother's, familiar and dear, but the letter ended abruptly, as if ripped in half. Near the bottom edge was a wax seal, half broken, bearing a single, imperious letter W. Ada did not need to be a local to understand the significance of that letter. The whispers had started as soon as she'd boarded the stage in Prescott. They traveled like the dust, seeping into every conversation. Whispers of a water thief, a land baron who was slowly strangling the life from the smaller ranches in the basin. His name was Silas Whitcomb, a man whose vast holdings spread across the valley like a shadow. The stories were all the same. Creeks that once ran year-round were now bone-dry by mid-July. Wells that had never failed were now spitting up mud. Whitcomb, they said, was diverting the water, building secret dams and ditches, hoarding the precious resource until his neighbors were forced to sell their parched lands to him for pennies on the dollar. He was a patient predator, and the entire basin was his hunting ground. Ada approached the station master, an old man with a tobacco-stained beard and weary eyes. "I'm looking for a guide," she said, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the low murmur of the station. "An honest one, someone who knows the draws and the mesas, who can read the land." The station master spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. He sized her up, taking in the determined set of her jaw and the lack of fear in her eyes. "Honest is a rare commodity in this basin. Ma'am, most men can be bought, but—" He paused, scratching his beard. "There's Creed, Eli Creed. His ranch is about 5 miles east of here. He don't say much, and he ain't looking for company, but a promise from him is set in stone. If he gives you his word, he'll see it through to the end, come hell or high water." Eli was greasing the main gear of the windmill pump when he saw her approaching, a lone figure walking steadily across the shimmering plain, kicking up small puffs of red dust with each step. He watched her approach with a weary sense of resignation. Strangers usually meant trouble, and trouble was something he had no time or energy for. He remained on the platform, his wrench in his hand, a silent, uninviting sentinel. She stopped at the base of the tower and looked up at him, shielding her eyes from the sun. "Mr. Creed, my name is Ada Linley. I was told you were a man who knows this land." "I am," he said, his voice rusty from disuse. He made no move to come down. "I need to hire you as a guide. I'm a hydrologist. I'm here to survey the underground water table." She held up the oilcloth packet. Eli looked down at her, his face an impassive mask. "I'm not for hire." His refusal was flat, final. He had his own burdens to carry. He had no desire to take on anyone else's. He turned back to the gear, a clear dismissal. But Ada Linley did not move. "I'll pay you well," she persisted. "And I can work. I'm no stranger to a ranch." He glanced down at her hands. He could see them clearly from his perch. The knuckles were slightly swollen, the palms calloused. These were not the hands of a pampered city woman. He looked at her eyes again. They met his without flinching, a direct, challenging gaze that held no plea, only an unwavering expectation. For the first time in a long time, Eli felt a flicker of something other than grief or exhaustion. It was a grudging respect. He hesitated, the wrench still in his hand. In that moment of hesitation, the wind, as if acting as an agent of fate, gusted sharply. It whipped around the tower, snatching a loose envelope from the top of Ada's open satchel. The single sheet of paper fluttered into the air, dancing on the current before landing in the dust near Eli's feet. He instinctively bent down and picked it up. It was an official-looking document, a coroner's report. His eyes scanned the lines of formal script, and then they stopped, snagging on a single name. Jonah Linley. He read the name again, and a cold knot formed in his stomach. He knew that name. Jonah had been a young homesteader who had owned a small plot of land bordering Rook Fork Creek, a plot that Silas Whitcomb had coveted for months. The report was brief, clinical, cause of death, accidental drowning, location a newly constructed ditching channel on the western edge of the Whitcomb property, an accident. Eli looked from the paper to the woman standing at the base of the tower. He saw the same square jaw, the same determined eyes. He saw the family resemblance, and suddenly, the map of underground streams and the mysterious W seal made a terrible kind of sense. This wasn't just a survey, this was a reckoning. He folded the paper slowly, his mind a whirl of suspicion and a long dormant sense of injustice. He held it out to her. Their fingers brushed as she took it, and the brief contact was like a spark of electricity. He saw the flash of pain in her eyes as she looked at her brother's name, a pain she quickly concealed behind her wall of resolve. He still hadn't said yes, but as he looked at her, standing firm against the vast, indifferent landscape, he knew his solitude was about to be broken. That night, Ada took a room at the Larkspur boarding house in the tiny township of Silver Spur. It was a clean, Spartan room with a single window that looked out over the dark, sleeping basin. The air was cooler now, and the silence was profound, broken only by the distant, mournful howl of a coyote. Ada sat on the edge of the stiff mattress, the map spread out before her, Jonah's last letter resting beside it. She traced the lines of the underground streams with her finger, her brother's words echoing in her mind. He had been so close to proving what Whitcomb was doing, so close to exposing the network of illegal dams and channels, and then he had had his accident. As she stared out into the immense darkness, a single, sharp crack echoed from the hills. A gunshot. It was not followed by another, just a single, solitary report that hung in the night air for a moment before being swallowed by the silence. It was a stark reminder of the lawlessness that simmered just beneath the surface of this hard land, a land where a man's life could be extinguished as easily as a candle flame. She did not shudder. Instead, she carefully folded the map, her resolve hardening into something as sharp and unyielding as steel. The first hint of dawn was a pale, gray wash in the eastern sky when the sound came. It was the desperate, heaving gasps of a dying animal. Eli was already awake, sitting at his kitchen table with a cup of black coffee, when he heard it. He grabbed his rifle and was out the door in an instant. There, collapsed against the front gate of Creed Hollow, was a magnificent black horse. Its flanks were lathered in sweat and foam, its chest heaving with ragged, exhausted breaths. It had been ridden hard, mercilessly, for miles. As Eli approached cautiously, the first rays of the rising sun caught the intricate tooling on the leather of the saddle. Burned deep into the fender, where a rider's leg would rest, was a single, ornate letter. W. The horse gave one last, shuddering sigh and was still. It lay there in the dust, a dark omen delivered to his very doorstep. The fragile peace of Creed Hollow had been shattered. The basin's silent war was no longer a distant rumor. It had arrived. The dead horse was a statement. Eli understood that as he dragged the heavy carcass away from his gate, the red dust clinging to the black hide. The W branded on the saddle was not just an insignia. It was a boundary line, drawn in arrogance and intimidation. Silas Whitcomb was marking his territory, and the arrival of this strange, determined woman had, it seemed, pushed him to redraw it. Ada Lindley appeared at his ranch house an hour later, her small trunk in hand, her face set. The smoke from the distant funeral pyre of the horse hung in the air between them, an unspoken word of warning. "I can pay," she said, cutting straight through the morning stillness. She held out a small leather purse. 50 cents a day, plus my own provisions, for your services as a guide. Eli looked at the purse, then at the W he had cut from the saddle leather, which now sat on his workbench. He didn't take the money. "I'm not for hire, Miss Lindley, but I'm fixin' to repair my windmill. You said you could work. You can earn your keep. We'll talk about guiding after." Her eyes narrowed slightly, suspicious of the offer, but she nodded. "Show me what needs doing." He accepted, not for her money, but because the dead horse had been a violation. Whitcomb had brought the shadow of his greed to Eli's doorstep, and Eli Creed did not abide threats on his own land. He had a new, unspoken condition, one he'd voiced to himself as he'd buried the animal. But he gave her the practical one. "One rule," he said, his voice flat as he picked up his tools. "We stick to my property in the open range. We don't go near Hawthorne Draw, especially after dark. It's not safe." "Because of Whitcomb," she stated. It wasn't a question. "Because," Eli replied, "some shadows in this basin carry rifles." The windmill was their first trial. It stood as a silent, skeletal sentinel over the ranch, its blades motionless against the oppressive blue sky. The silence of the ranch was profound without the familiar, rhythmic clank-squeak of the pump rod. It was the sound of failure. "She seized up 2 days ago," Eli said, gesturing upward. "Bearings likely shot, and the pump leather needs replacing." He began the long climb up the tower ladder, expecting her to wait below. Instead, he heard the steady ring of her boots on the rungs right behind him. They stood together on the small wooden platform, 100 feet above the basin, the world spreading out around them in a panorama of red rock and parched earth. The wind was stronger up here, whipping her hair from its severe bun. The work was hard, greasy, and precise. Eli attached a block and tackle to the main assembly, his movements economical and sure. He had to lift the heavy gearbox just enough to get at the main shaft bearing. "The fantail vane is loose," Ada observed, her voice clear over the wind. She wasn't just watching, she was analyzing. The governor's not engaging, which means it's not turning itself out of the high winds. That's what probably burned out the bearing. Eli paused, impressed. "You know windmills." "I know water," she corrected him. "And the machines that move it." For the next 2 hours, they worked as a team. He was the muscle, bracing himself against the tower to turn the heavy wrenches, his forearms tight with the strain. She was the precision, her smaller, nimble fingers working into the tight spaces, cleaning the old grease, guiding the new components into place. She pointed out a hairline crack in the sucker rod joint he had missed. He showed her how to properly seat the new graphite-impregnated bearing, packing it with thick, black lubricant until it moved with a smooth, heavy tension. Then came the well itself. Eli rigged a harness and lowered himself into the darkness of the stone-lined shaft. Ada remained above, her task to lower the new pump leather and measure the water level. She took a weighted cord from her own satchel and dropped it down the dark hole, her eyes fixed on the line as it paid out. "How deep?" he called up, his voice echoing from the cool darkness. 84 feet to the bottom," she called back. "But the water level, Mr. Creed, it's only at 79 feet. The recovery rate must be almost nothing." When he emerged, covered in grime and damp earth, she was looking at the horizon, her brow furrowed. "That well should be hitting the main aquifer," she said, more to herself than to him. "It's as if the entire basin's supply is being siphoned off from below." By late afternoon, the windmill was repaired. Eli engaged the gear, and with a groan of new metal, the giant blade slowly turned, catching the breeze. A moment later, they heard the most beautiful sound in the desert, the rhythmic thump of the pump rod, followed by a gush of clear, cold water pouring into the stock tank. Eli watched the water, a rare flicker of satisfaction in his eyes. Ada was wiping the grease from her hands with a piece of burlap. She had proven her worth. "Now," she said, "about that survey." He nodded, conceding. "Tomorrow. We'll check the north pasture." But Ada was not content to wait. That evening, as the sun began to dip, painting the clouds in shades of bruised purple and orange, she walked the perimeter of the ranch yard. Eli watched her from the porch, curious. She had pulled 2 items from her trunk, a long coil of heavy twine and a single, polished brass rod, about 3 feet long, with a cup at one end. She began pacing the dry ground near the chicken coop, laying out the twine in a meticulous grid. Eli thought it was some strange Eastern ritual. Then she knelt. She drove the brass rod a few inches into the baked earth. She pressed her ear to the cupped end. Closing her eyes, she remained perfectly still for a long minute. Eli, his curiosity overriding his reserve, walked over. "What are you doing, Miss Lindley?" She held up a hand for silence, listening intently. Then she moved the rod 10 feet to the left, repeating the process. She looked like a musician tuning an instrument. "Here," she said suddenly, tapping the ground. "There's water here, shallow, a small artery, maybe 5 feet down." Eli frowned. "That's impossible. This ground is high. The well is where the water is." "The well is where the deep water is," she said, standing up. "This is a seam. The rock is porous here. I can hear the water moving through it." He was deeply skeptical. This bordered on the water witching he'd heard tales of, and he was a practical man. Hear it. Water moving through rock makes a specific resonance, she explained, her voice losing its guarded tone and taking on the enthusiasm of an expert. This rod amplifies it. Your windmill pulls from the aquifer. This is just runoff, a hidden spring, probably being squeezed out by the drought. She pointed. Dig here. He fetched a shovel, feeling foolish. He was indulging her strange methods. He broke the hard crust of the earth. The digging was hard. The soil like brick. 1 foot, 2 feet. He hit a layer of shale. Just below that, she encouraged. He slammed the shovel down, breaking the rock, and then he felt it. The resistance of the ground changed. The soil became dark, then damp. He lifted a shovelful of thick, black mud. He stared at it, then at her. Ada Lindley merely smiled. A small, tight curve of the lips. It's not enough for irrigation, but it's enough for the house and the chickens. You could sink a cistern here and save the windmill for the cattle. Eli stood there, leaning on the shovel, the smell of damp earth rising in the cool evening air. This woman was not what he expected. She was not just a grieving sister on a quest for vengeance. She was an expert, armed with skills he didn't understand, and for the first time he felt a grudging admiration. The next day, they rode out to the north pasture. The reality of the basin's plight became clear. Eli pointed to a wide, dusty flat that should have been knee-deep in grama grass. Whitcomb's cattle, he said, dismounting. He kicked at a patch of ground grazed down to the bare roots. He's moved his herd south a full month early. He's already exhausted his own pastures. He's run out of water, Ada said, her voice grim. She was checking the bed of a small creek that fed the pasture. It was bone dry. The mud cracked into a perfect mosaic. This should still be running. Where is he getting the water for 1,000 head of cattle? Their route took them past the edge of the township, a small collection of wooden buildings shimmering in the heat. A man was loading feed sacks onto a wagon at the general store. He saw Eli and his face, already worn with worry, turned pale. Mr. Creed, the man said, approaching them nervously. He kept glancing over his shoulder. It was Thomas Vale, a man who had worked for Eli for 10 years before the drought had forced Eli to let him go. Thomas, Eli said, nodding. You well? I am. Thomas stammered. He looked at Ada, his eyes wide with something close to fear. Mr. Creed, sir, I heard you had a visitor. You shouldn't be riding with her. Miss Lindley is a surveyor, Eli said, his voice hardening at the warning. She's asking questions, Thomas whispered, stepping closer. Dangerous questions, just like her brother did. He wrung his dusty hat in his hands. After I left here, I took work at the Whitcomb Ranch, just for a month. I saw things. Eli? What things? Ada interjected, leaning down from her horse. Tomas flinched. He's not just diverting the creek. He's got machinery, pipes. He's pulling water from somewhere deep. And he's got protection. You can't fight him. Mr. Creed. It ain't just that he's rich. He owns the river. And he owns the jury that says the river is his. Before they could ask more, Thomas saw a wagon bearing the W brand crest the hill. He threw the last sack onto his wagon and scrambled up. You keep her away from Hawthorne Draw. He's already put 1 person in the ground. He won't hesitate to make it 2. He snapped the reins, and the wagon rattled away, leaving them in a cloud of dust and fear. The ride back to Creed Hollow was silent, the weight of Tomas's warning settling between them, as the sun dipped low, casting long, grotesque shadows across the trail. Eli suddenly reined in his horse. He was staring at a high mesa 2 miles to the east. What is it? Ada asked. Up there, he said, his voice low. On the ridge. Ada squinted. A single black shape stood against the blood-red sky. A man on a horse, perfectly still. Even at this distance, there was an air of menace about him. As they watched, a glint of light flashed from the figure, the sun reflecting off the lens of a spyglass. Pike Mallory, Eli said, his name tasting like ash. Whitcomb's foreman. He's watching us. They rode the rest of the way in a tense hurry, the feeling of being observed crawling on their skin. When they reached the ranch, the oppressive silence of the yard felt different. It felt wrong. Eli, his senses sharpened by the encounter, dismounted and walked not to the house, but to the stable. He had put a new, heavy brass lock on the door after he'd found the dead horse. He knelt by it. In the fading light, he saw them fine, thin scratches marring the metal around the keyhole. Someone had tried to pick it while they were gone. He drew his pistol, motioning for Ada to stay back. He entered the stable, his eyes adjusting to the gloom. The horses were there, nickering softly, but they seemed agitated. He checked the tack room. Nothing seemed out of place. Then he saw it, near the back wall, in the damp earth by the water trough. A boot print. It wasn't his, it wasn't Ada's. It was large, with a deep heel. And in the center of the heel were studs driven in to form a crude letter, M. Mallory. He hadn't just been watching, he had been here. He found Ada in the ranch house kitchen, her own trunk open on the floor. She was holding a small, leather-bound notebook, running her thumb over the cover. She looked up as he entered, her face pale but composed. She quickly tucked the notebook back into a false bottom beneath her clothes. He saw the movement, but said nothing. It was Jonah's. He was sure of it. The evidence Tomas had warned them about. That night, the small house felt like a fortress under siege. They ate a simple dinner of bean stew and hardtack biscuits, the silence broken only by the scrape of spoons against tin plates. Ada was polite, thanking him for the meal, but her composure was strained. She kept her back to the wall, her eyes flickering to the dark windows. When it was time to sleep, the unspoken tension of their arrangement filled the room. The ranch house had only his bedroom and a small cot in the main room, where he usually sat. "You can take the guest bed," he said, gesturing to his own room. She looked at him, surprised. No, that's your room. I'll take the settee." "It's the only proper bed," Eli said, his voice firm. He walked into the bedroom and came out with his own pillow and a threadbare blanket. He didn't make a show of his sacrifice. He simply tossed the bedding onto the short, lumpy settee by the cold fireplace. "You'll be safer in there. Bar the door." Ada stared at him. He was a gnarled, solitary man, as hard as the land he worked. But this gesture was one of profound, unexpected decency. He was offering her protection, not demanding anything in return. He was giving her the fortress while he slept on the perimeter. She nodded, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. "Thank you, Mr. Creed." She went into the bedroom and slid the heavy iron bolt across the door. From the other side, she heard the groan of the settee springs as Eli settled in, his long frame impossibly cramped on the small couch. He would not sleep well. But as Ada lay in the dark, listening to the lonely cry of the wind outside the window and the steady, quiet breathing of the man in the next room, a single, tiny fissure appeared in the wall of ice around her heart. It was the first flicker of trust she had allowed herself to feel in a very long time. The morning broke cold and sharp, the sky a pale, unforgiving gray before the sun had crested the mesas. Eli, having spent the night on the lumpy settee, rose with a stiffness in his joints. He found Ada already outside by the corral, studying his horses. The air was so still he could hear the thump of the windmill pump from 100 yards away. She had her gaze fixed on a particular horse, a dappled gray gelding with a mean eye and a perpetually pinned back set of ears. His name was Concho. "That one's not for you," Eli said, his voice a low gravel. He walked over, carrying a bridle. "He's got a spiteful streak. You'll take the bay." "The bay is tired," Ada replied, not looking at him. "He was ridden hard yesterday. This one," she pointed to the gray, "is fresh, and he's watching me. He's smart. I prefer smart to stubborn." Eli stopped. Smart is what makes him dangerous. He knows how to unseat a rider who isn't paying attention. I always pay attention, she said. She held out her hand, and the gray horse, Concho, snorted, tossing his head. But he didn't back away. He sniffed her hand, his lip curling back. I'll ride him. Eli sighed, but he handed her the bridle. He wouldn't argue. He had a feeling arguing with Ada Lindley was like arguing with a drought. You just had to endure it. The first 10 minutes were a battle of wills. Concho sidestepped, crow-hopped, and tried to scrape her off on the corral fence. Ada moved with him, her body tense but balanced, her hands light on the reins, refusing to give him the fight he wanted. Eli watched from the center of the ring, arms crossed. You're holding him too tight, Eli called out. You're telling him you're scared. Give him his head, but let him know you're in charge. I am in charge, she muttered through gritted teeth. She eased the pressure, and Concho, surprised, settled into a rough trot. She was doing well, finding his rhythm, until a rabbit bolted from under the water trough. Concho didn't bolt. He propped. All 4 feet hit the ground at once, a dead stop that was designed to send the rider flying. Ada, caught by surprise, was thrown forward. She lost her stirrups and toppled sideways, a cry of surprise escaping her. It was a light fall, more a stumble from the saddle than a true buck-off, but she was tangled in the reins. Eli was moving before she even hit the ground. He was there in 2 long strides, grabbing Concho's bridle with one hand to stop the horse from dragging her, and his other hand shot out to her. He caught her by the waist, his grip firm, steadying her as she found her footing. The world stopped for a half-second. His hand was broad and calloused, a solid, warm presence against the small of her back. She had her own hand on his forearm to balance herself. Through the rough denim of his shirt, she could feel the rigid strength of the muscle beneath, hard as oak. They stood frozen for a moment, far closer than they had ever been. She could smell the faint scent of axle grease, coffee, and the dry, dusty scent of the man himself. His eyes, usually so distant, were fixed on hers, sharp and assessing, checking for injury. I'm all right, she said, her voice breathier than she intended. She stepped back, untangling her hand from the reins, and the contact was broken. The air rushed back in, cold and sharp. I told you, Eli said, but the words had no bite. He was looking at her, a strange expression on his face. He plants his feet. I'll know for next time, Ada said, brushing the red dust from her skirt. She was flustered, but she'd be damned if she let him see it. She gathered the reins, shortened them, and put her foot back in the stirrup. Give me a leg up. He cupped his hands, and she mounted again, this time settling firmly in the saddle. She rode Concho for another 30 minutes, and the horse, as if sensing the fall had only hardened her resolve, finally gave in, his ears flicking forward in grudging acceptance. They spent the rest of the morning on practical skills. The ranch was a machine, and Eli was a man who believed in maintaining his tools. You can ride, he conceded, but can you tie a knot that won't slip? He took a length of heavy rope from the stable wall. This is a water braid. We use it for lowering equipment into the wells. A slip knot can cost you a bucket. A bad knot can cost you more. He showed her how to weave the strands, his large, rough hands moving with surprising dexterity, forming a knot that was both intricate and immensely strong. She watched, her mind working, seeing the physics of it, the way the tension was distributed. He unraveled it and handed her the rope. Your turn. Her first attempt was clumsy, the rope stiff and uncooperative. Her second was better, but she crossed the final loop incorrectly. No, he said. His voice was patient. Like this. He stood behind her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his chest. He didn't touch her, but he guided her hands with his words. The standing end goes over, then under the loop you made. Pull it tight against itself. Yes, like that. She pulled it, and the knot locked into place. It was perfect. She looked up at him, a small flash of pride in her eyes. "I'm a fast learner." "So I see," he said. Next was the lariat. He took her to the open pasture, where he had set up a fence post as a target. "This isn't for show," he said, swinging the heavy, waxed rope in a slow circle. "It's for pulling a calf out of a bog or snagging a runaway mule. It's a tool, not a toy." He cast the loop, and it sailed out, perfectly round, settling over the post with a soft thwip. He was all fluid motion, a seamless extension of the rope. He handed it to her. Her first throw was a disaster. The loop collapsed in midair and landed in a heap 10 feet short. She flushed, frustrated. "You're trying to force it," Eli said. "You're throwing it with your arm. It's not your arm. It's your wrist, your shoulder. It's balance." She tried again, focusing on his words. She thought of the physics of water pressure, of the precise calculations needed to map an aquifer. This was just another calculation. Weight, momentum, velocity. She spun the loop, felt the tug of its weight, and let it go. It wobbled, but it flew true, landing beside the post. "Closer," he said. She spent an hour at it. Her arm began to ache, her hands raw from the stiff rope. But with each throw, the loop grew more stable, the distance more accurate. Finally, she swung it, released it, and watched as it flew. A perfect, open circle, dropping cleanly over the post. She turned to him, a triumphant, unguarded smile breaking across her face. "See a fast learner." Eli looked at her, her face bright with a small victory, the dust on her cheek, her hair coming loose from its bun, and he did something he hadn't done in years. He smiled. It wasn't a big smile. It was a small, almost imperceptible lifting at the corner of his mouth, a brief flash of warmth in his desolate eyes. It was there for a second, and then it was gone. But she had seen it. The small, shared moment hung in the air, as real and tangible as the rope in her hand. They broke for coffee in the cold morning air, leaning against the warm wood of the water trough, the sound of the newly flowing water, a quiet music behind them. The steam from their tin cups rose in white plumes, mingling between them. The silence that settled was no longer the tense, wary silence of the first day. It was softer, more comfortable. Ada was the first to speak, her gaze distant, fixed on the red cliffs of the basin. "We had a barley farm back in Ohio," she said, her voice quiet. "My father, Jonah, and me." She ran a finger around the rim of her cup. "It was good land, but the rains, they stopped being reliable. We had 3 years of drought, one after the other. The creek dried to a trickle." She paused, remembering. "My father would pray for rain. Jonah and I, we started digging. We tried to find a spring. We read every book we could find on geology, on water tables. That's where I learned to listen to the ground. That's where I learned to measure the drop in a well. When you measure your life in inches of water, you learn to be precise." She took a sip of the bitter coffee. "The farm failed. It broke my father, but it forged Jonah and me. We swore we'd never be at the mercy of the weather, or of men who controlled the water. Again, he came out here to find land where the water was deep and safe. He wrote to me. He said he'd found it. He said he'd found a place we could be secure." Her voice hardened. "And then he had his accident." Eli listened, his expression unreadable. He watched the steam from his own cup. He understood. He understood the desperation of drought. He understood the fight for inches. "Before Martha got sick," he said, his own voice sounding strange as he spoke of her, "I was a scout for the territorial survey." Ada looked at him, surprised. That explained his economical movements, the way he seemed to read the wind and the land. "I didn't lead wagon trains," he said. "I went ahead, alone, for months at a time. Just me, a mule, and a transit. I mapped the draws, the rivers, the springs. I drew the lines that would become county borders. He looked down at his hands, as if seeing the transit and the compass in them. I know every rock and every dry wash in this basin. I know it better than I know the faces of the people in town. I know it like the back of my own hand. He looked up, and his eyes met hers. And I know that Rook Fork Creek, where your brother was found, doesn't just go dry. Not ever, not even in a drought like this. Someone had to have bled it. In that moment, their alliance was sealed. It was no longer a business transaction or a reluctant hospitality. It was a shared understanding, forged from their separate pasts. Two experts in their own fields, staring at the same unsolvable problem. As if the land itself were listening. A sound drifted down from Bramble Mesa, the high, flat-topped hill to the north. It was a high, yipping wail, followed by a chorus of other voices. A pack of coyotes, celebrating a kill. The sound was eerie, lonely, and full of wild hunger. Eli tensed, his hand instinctively moving toward the pistol on his hip. It was a reflex, the rancher's instinct to protect his stock. Ada didn't even flinch. She just took another sip of coffee, her gaze fixed on the mesa. "They sound hungry," she said, her voice calm. Eli looked at her. The sound that made most settlers lock their doors and check their rifle loads was, to her, just another sound of the wilderness. He realized she was not just accustomed to danger. She was comfortable in it. She was, in her own way, as tough and resilient as the coyotes themselves. She belonged in this hard, unforgiving land far more than she belonged on a barley farm in Ohio. The fragile peace of the morning was broken by the arrival of a wagon. It was Merritt, the blacksmith from Silver Spur, his face grim under a layer of soot. He was a man who preferred the roar of his forge to conversation, so his presence meant trouble. "Eli," he said, not bothering with pleasantries. He nodded at Ada, his eyes wary. "Thought you should know. That order I was curious about. It came in on the freight line this morning." "What order?" Eli asked, though he already felt a cold dread. "Pipe," Merritt said, spitting. 20 lengths of 8-inch steel pipe, riveted, heavy gauge, the kind the railroads use for water towers. "Who ordered it?" Ada asked, her voice sharp. "The W Ranch. Of course." Merritt said, "Pike Mallory signed for it himself, paid in cash. They're loading it onto flatbeds as we speak." The implication was immediate and sickening. Whitcomb wasn't just maintaining his illegal dam. He was expanding it. He was going to sink that large-gauge pipe deep into the aquifer, the very one Ada had said was being siphoned, and drain the basin dry for good. Merritt climbed back onto his wagon. "Just thought you should know what you're up against. Be careful. Eli? That much pipe. A man could get lost inside one of those trenches." He flicked the reins and was gone, leaving a heavy silence in his wake. Ada stared at the dust cloud from his wagon, her mind racing. The map, the boot print, the dead horse, and now the pipe. The pieces were locking into place. "Tonight," she said, her voice low and hard. Eli turned to her. "Tonight what?" "Tonight we follow that pipeline. We have to, if he gets that pipe in the ground, it's over, for you, for me, for this entire valley." Eli weighed the risk. It was a fool's errand. They would be trespassing on Whitcomb's land patrolled by men like Pike Mallory. They would be outnumbered, outgunned. It was suicide. He thought of his quiet life, his grief, the fragile peace he had built. He looked at Ada. He saw her brother's name on the coroner's report. He saw the boot print in his own stable. He heard the sound of the W horse collapsing at his gate. His quiet life was already over. Hawthorne Draw. He said, "Thomas Vale warned us away. That's where they'll be. It's the only place deep enough to hide that kind of work." He looked up at the sky, judging the sun. "It'll be moonless for the first few hours of the night. We can use the creek bed for cover." He was no longer a man considering. He was a scout, planning a route.
"If we get separated,"
Ada said, her mind moving just as fast.
"we need a signal."
"A quail call," Eli said immediately.
3 short, 2 long, 1 short, 3, 2, 1.
It's common enough not to raise suspicion, but distinct enough for us to hear. They spent the afternoon in quiet, tense preparation. Eli cleaned his Spencer carbine. Ada checked the supplies in her satchel, replacing her survey tools with a coil of thin, strong wire, a small file, and a heavy-duty wrench. Just before dusk, as Eli was in the stable saddling the horses, the reliable bay for her this time, and his own steady mount, Ada stood in the kitchen. The house was quiet. The only sound the ticking of the mantel clock. She took a small piece of paper from her notebook and a pencil. She paused, her hand hovering over the paper. She thought of Jonah. She thought of the risk. She was not a fool. She knew she might not come back from Hawthorne Draw. With a steady hand, she wrote, "If I do not return, send my trunk to Reverend Amon Pike in Prescott. He will know what to do." She folded the paper and slid it under the sugar bowl on the kitchen table, a small white flag of surrender to a fate she was actively running to meet. She turned to leave, and her heart jumped. Eli was standing in the doorway, watching her. His face was in shadow. She had no idea how long he had been there. He didn't ask what the note said. He didn't need to. His eyes met hers, and in their depths, she saw a shared, grim understanding. He knew exactly what she had just done. He knew the price they were both willing to pay. "It's time," he said, and stepped back to let her pass. The night that fell over the red kestrel basin was absolute, a black, starless void that swallowed the horizon and erased the familiar shapes of the mesas. A sliver of a waning moon hung in the sky, offering no more light than a distant, dying ember. This was the darkness Eli Creed knew best, the scout's darkness, a world reduced to sound, scent, and the feel of the ground through the soles of his boots. They moved as ghosts, leading their horses down the treacherous, rock-strewn path into the maw of Hawthorne Draw. The air grew colder, heavier, smelling of damp stone and decay. Every rustle of a bush, every dislodged pebble that skittered into the blackness, sounded as loud as a gunshot in the profound silence. Eli led the way, his hand resting on the smooth stock of his Spencer, his senses stretched taut as a wire. Ada followed a few feet behind, her hand on the bay's bridle, her step so light she barely seemed to disturb the dust. The draw was a deep scar in the earth, its walls rising steeply on either side, blotting out what little sky was visible. Down here, the wind died, and the silence was so complete it seemed to press in on them, a physical weight. They were descending into Silas Whitcomb's private kingdom, a place where his law was the only one that mattered. After nearly an hour of careful, nerve-wracking progress, Eli held up a hand, stopping them. He pointed ahead into the gloom. At first, Ada saw nothing, then she heard it. A faint, rhythmic, metallic sound. Squeak, clank, squeak, clank. It was a man-made sound, unnatural in this wild place. It was the sound of a hand-cranked bilge pump, working against a heavy load. They tethered the horses in a thicket of salt cedar, muffling their bridles with scraps of burlap Eli had brought. On foot, they crept forward, using the deep shadows of the canyon wall for cover. The sound grew louder, accompanied by the low murmur of voices. They rounded a bend and saw it. Willow Sink was a natural depression, a wide basin that should have been a seasonal marsh. Now, it was a hive of clandestine activity. A single lantern, its glass panes heavily smeared with mud to dim its glow, cast a sickly, yellow circle of light. In that circle, 2 men were laboring over a large, iron hand pump. A series of newly laid wooden troughs snaked away from it, disappearing into a deep, freshly dug trench where the dark cylindrical shapes of the 8-inch pipe lay waiting. The pump was mounted on a heavy timber frame built over what looked like a wellhead. But it wasn't a well. It was a sump, the collection point for an entire system. This was the heart of the operation. This was where Whitcomb was bleeding the basin's aquifer. Eli motioned for Ada to stay put while he scouted the perimeter. Ada, however, had her own mission. She unslung her satchel and removed her own strange device. It was a simple thing of her own, making a long, thin glass tube, sealed at one end, with measurements carefully etched into the side. The open end was fitted with a rubber stopper, through which a narrow copper pipe was inserted. It was a rudimentary pressure gauge, a manometer. She crept to the edge of the nearest trough, where a steady stream of stolen water was flowing. The water was unnaturally cold, proof that it was being drawn from deep underground, not from any surface spring. She dipped the end of the copper pipe into the stream, holding the glass tube vertically. Immediately, the water rushed into the tube, compressing the trapped air at the top. She watched the column of water rise. Her eyes narrowed in concentration. It climbed past the first mark, then the second. It finally stopped at a point far higher than any natural artesian pressure could account for. The pump wasn't just draining the water. It was pulling it with a powerful, artificial suction. Whitcomb hadn't just built a dam. He had built a machine to actively suck the lifeblood from the land. The reading on her simple device was a clear, scientific confession of his crime. Meanwhile, Eli had circled around the work site, moving from shadow to shadow with the practiced ease of a predator. He was focused on a small, rough-hewn shed that stood just outside the lantern's glow. Its door was slightly ajar. He knew that an operation of this size required records, shipments, wages, schedules, and records were proof. He slipped inside. The darkness in the shed even more profound than that of the draw. It smelled of damp earth, grease, and cheap tobacco. He waited for his eyes to adjust. His hand on the butt of his pistol. He could make out the shapes of barrels, coils of rope, and a stack of shovels. On a crude table in the corner sat a single, heavy, leather-bound book, a ledger. He pulled a lucifer from his pocket, shielding its flare with his body. The sudden burst of light a shocking violation of the darkness. In the brief, flickering light, he saw the embossed W on the cover of the book. He opened it. The pages were filled with neat columns of figures and names. He saw entries for wages paid to a dozen men he didn't recognize, hired muscle, likely brought in from outside the basin. He saw shipments of blasting powder, timber, and steel rivets. And then he saw a page that made the breath catch in his throat. It was a separate accounting, under the heading Special Disbursements. There were 2 entries. The first was a large sum, paid out 2 months prior, next to the name P. Mallory. The second, dated just last week, was for a sum 3 times as large, and the name written beside it, in the bookkeeper's careful script, was Honorable Judge Alistair Corby. It was the proof they needed, the missing link. Whitcomb didn't just own the water, he owned the law itself. Eli knew he couldn't take the whole book. It would be missed immediately. He carefully tore out the single page, the sound of the ripping paper deafening in the silence. Tucked into the ledger's binding was a thin sheet of paper, a federal tax stamp for a recent land purchase. The very document Marshal Delaney had said was often falsified in fraudulent claims. He pocketed that as well. He was about to extinguish the match when he caught the scent again. Cheap tobacco. But this time it was fresh, cloying, and it was coming from right outside the shed. Eli dropped and blew out the match in the same motion, plunging the shed back into darkness. He held his breath, listening. He heard the crunch of a boot on gravel, just outside the door. He recognized the smell now. It was a specific blend of cheap, sweet tobacco that only one man in the basin smoked, Pike Mallory. Eli's heart hammered against his ribs. He was trapped. He drew his pistol, the click of the hammer being cocked sounding like a cannon shot to his own ears. He pressed himself against the interior wall, his eyes straining to pierce the gloom. Back at the edge of the clearing, Ada had finished her reading. She carefully poured the water from the tube and was packing her equipment when she heard it. A faint, sharp click. It sounded like metal on metal. It came from the direction of the horses. Her blood ran cold. One of the horses, likely the ill-tempered Concho, had shifted its weight, and a buckle on its rein had clinked against the steel of the bit. It was a tiny sound, but in the dead silence of the draw, it was enough. One of the men at the pump froze, his head cocked. "What was that?" he hissed. The other man stopped cranking. Sounded like a rockfall. "No," a third voice said. A low, dangerous drawl that seemed to emanate from the shadows near the shed. It was Pike Mallory. That was Tack. In an instant, the scene exploded into chaos. Mallory shouted, "We've got company! Check the west trail!" The lantern was ripped from its hook, its muddy glass now casting a wild, swinging beam of light that sliced through the darkness. The two men grabbed their rifles, which had been leaning against the pump. "Go!" Eli's voice was a harsh whisper from the shadows. He burst from the shed, not towards Ada, but in the opposite direction, drawing their attention. "Get to the horses now!" Ada didn't hesitate. She scrambled back towards the salt cedar thicket, her heart pounding. The beam of the lantern swept past her, illuminating the canyon wall just inches from her head. A man was crashing through the undergrowth behind her. She could hear his heavy, labored breathing. She reached the horses just as Eli came sprinting up from the other side. He was already untying the reins, his movements swift and sure. "Get on," he ordered. The first shot cracked through the night, the bullet whining past Eli's head and smacking into a rock with a sharp crack. Ada was in the saddle, but the man chasing her was closing in. He was on the bank of a deep, slippery irrigation ditch that ran parallel to the trail. He raised his rifle. Ada reacted on pure instinct. Her satchel was still slung over her shoulder. It was heavy, filled with her metal tools and samples of collected earth. She swung it with all her might. It wasn't a sandbag, but it served the same purpose. The heavy bag caught the man squarely in the chest. He grunted, lost his footing on the slick, muddy bank, and tumbled backward into the ditch with a loud splash and a curse. It bought them a precious few seconds. Eli was on his horse now, and they spurred the animals into a gallop, thundering down the narrow, dark draw. Behind them, shouts and curses echoed off the canyon walls. Another gunshot roared, this one deafeningly close. The bullet didn't whine past them. It chewed a furrow in the dirt directly in front of Ada's horse. The bay screamed and reared, its eyes wide with terror. Ada fought to control the panicked animal, but the trail was narrow and treacherous. They were completely exposed. In that split second of chaos, Eli reacted. He leaned from his saddle, his arm shooting out like a striking snake. He grabbed the front of Ada's jacket, and with a strength born of pure adrenaline, he hauled her sideways. "Jump!" he roared. He pulled her clear of the saddle just as the horse bolted. They fell together, a tangled heap of limbs, tumbling down a steep, gravelly embankment and landing hard at the bottom of a dry, narrow gully. The fall knocked the wind out of her. For a moment, she lay there, stunned, the rough gravel biting into her cheek, Eli's heavy weight pinning her down. She could hear the thunder of their pursuers' horses galloping past on the trail above them, the riders shouting in confusion as they chased the riderless bay. They lay in the darkness, not daring to move, listening as the hoofbeats faded into the distance. The silence that returned was thick with the smell of gunpowder and their own ragged breathing. Finally, Eli shifted his weight off her, his movements slow and careful. "You hurt," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "No," she managed to gasp, her chest aching. "I don't think so." They remained in the gully for what felt like an eternity, listening for any sign of their pursuers returning, but there was nothing. They had escaped. The journey back to Creed Hollow was a long, silent ordeal. They walked, leading Eli's single remaining horse. The riderless bay was lost to the night. They were exhausted, bruised, and covered in mud. But clutched in Eli's pocket was the torn ledger page and the tax stamp. They had the proof. When they finally stumbled into the relative safety of the ranch house, the adrenaline that had sustained them for hours drained away in a sudden, sickening rush. Eli lit a lamp, and in the soft glow, he saw that Ada was trembling. It wasn't from the cold. It was a deep, uncontrollable shudder that racked her entire body, a reaction to the terror and the violence of the night. Her face was chalk white, her eyes wide and haunted. She wrapped her arms around herself, but it did nothing to stop the shaking. Eli stood there for a moment, uncertain. He was not a man comfortable with displays of emotion, his own or anyone else's. He was a man of fences and boundaries and solitude. But seeing her like this, so vulnerable after being so impossibly strong, broke through his reserve. He stepped forward. He didn't speak. He simply placed his hand on her shoulder. His hand was heavy, calloused, and surprisingly warm. It was not a romantic touch. It was not possessive. It was a gesture of simple, grounding human contact. It was an anchor in the storm of her fear. He kept his distance, his touch respectful, a silent message that said, "You are safe now. I am here." Ada flinched at the initial contact. Then, slowly, she leaned into the pressure of his hand. She closed her eyes, and the violent trembling began to subside, replaced by a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. She didn't pull away, and he didn't move his hand. They stood there for a long moment in the quiet lamplight, two solitary figures bound together by the dangerous secrets of the unforgiving night. The night in Hawthorne Draw had changed them. The shared terror, the desperate escape, and the quiet comfort of Eli's hand on her shoulder had burned away the last of their polite reservations. They were no longer a landowner and a guide. They were allies, bound by a dangerous secret and the ledger page hidden beneath Eli's floorboards. The sun rose on a different dynamic at Creed Hollow, one built not on suspicion, but on a fragile, hard-won trust. The daylight brought a new kind of work. After the morning chores, Eli led Ada to the far end of the corral, where a row of rusted tin cans sat on a fence rail. He carried his Spencer carbine, its wooden stock smooth and dark with use. "You know how to use one of these?" he asked, his voice all business. "I've fired a shotgun to scare crows," Ada replied, her eyes on the weapon. "Never a rifle?" "This isn't for scaring crows," Eli said grimly. "And it's not for what happened last night, not if we can help it." He held the rifle out to her. "But first, this is a tool for last resorts, and like any tool, you'll learn to use it safely before you learn to use it well." He spent an hour with her, his voice the patient, exacting tone of a seasoned scout. He made her handle the rifle when it was unloaded, working the lever action, feeling the weight and balance, learning the precise click of the hammer. He stressed the principles of safety until they were ingrained. Always treat it as if it's loaded. Never point it at anything you don't intend to harm. Always be sure of your target and what's behind it. He was a strict teacher, correcting her stance, the placement of her cheek against the stock, the way she breathed. "You're holding your breath," he corrected her. "You'll pull the shot, breathe in, let half of it out, and then squeeze the trigger. Don't pull it. Don't jerk it. Squeeze it, like it's a lemon and you just want one drop of juice." He finally loaded a single cartridge. The first shot was loud, the recoil much stronger than she'd expected. It slammed into her shoulder, and the bullet kicked up dust a foot to the left of the nearest can. "You flinched," he said, not unkindly. "You expected the kick. Don't let it be a surprise every time." She reloaded, set her jaw, and took a breath. She let it out halfway. She looked down the iron sights, the can a blurry shape, the front sight a sharp, clear post. She squeezed. The explosion felt like a part of her this time. The can leaped from the fence and spun into the air, a clean hole punched through its center. She looked at Eli, a small, proud spark in her eye. He nodded, a flicker of that rare smile touching his lips. Again, all of them. She worked her way down the line of cans, the rhythm of the lever action becoming more familiar, her shoulder beginning to ache, but her aim holding true. Eli didn't teach her to be a duelist. He taught her to be deliberate, to be safe, and to make every shot count. He was teaching her control, a skill he valued above all others. That evening, the kitchen table became their war room. The lamp cast a warm, golden circle on the worn wood. Eli spread out his old, cracked survey maps, the ones he had drawn for the territory, their lines precise and beautiful, charting every mesa and dry wash. Then, Ada brought out her brother's ledger. She opened it, past the first few pages of farm accounts, to the section that was written in a language only she and Jonah understood. It was a dense shorthand of symbols, measurements, and geological notations.
"This was our code,"
she said, her voice soft as she traced a symbol that looked like 3 wavy lines over a triangle. "When we were trying to find water on the farm, this means a stratified rock layer, porous, at a depth of 40 feet. Eli leaned closer, his rough-hewn features softened by the lamplight. He pointed to a set of numbers on his own map. "That's my sounding," he said, a note of surprise in his voice. "I marked shale at 45 feet in that exact quadrant." He looked at her, his respect for her and her brother growing. He wasn't just guessing, he was a professional.
"He was,"
she affirmed, a sad pride in her voice.
"He was brilliant."
For hours, they worked, their 2 worlds colliding on the table. His maps provided the skin of the land. Her brother's journal provided the veins beneath it. She would read a notation. High-pressure draw-off, 2.8 inches, and he would point to the map. "That's Rook Fork Creek, just upstream from his claim. It's the only place it could be." They found the discrepancies, the places where Jonah's pressure readings were impossibly low. "He's not just diverting the surface water," Ada said, her finger tapping a location. "He's sinking shafts, here and here. He's poaching the aquifer before it can feed the creeks." The next day, their combined maps led them to a barren stretch of land that belonged to no one, a dusty alkali flat miles from any known creek. Jonah's map showed a cluster of symbols Ada couldn't decipher, but Eli's map marked it as a sinkhole.
"I don't understand,"
Ada said. "Why would he be interested in this?" "Let's find out," Eli said. He dismounted and went to his saddlebag. He returned not with a tool, but with a small cloth bag of his late wife's. It was filled with blue laundry powder. "You can trace a leak with dye," he said, "or if you don't have dye, you use this." He walked to the edge of the sinkhole and, bracing himself, poured the entire bag of bright blue powder into the cracked, dry earth. It vanished into the darkness. "Now we wait," he said. They rode 2 miles south to a small, dying spring on the edge of Mrs. Finola Dade's property. The spring was barely a muddy seep, not enough to water a single cow. They sat in silence, watching it. An hour passed. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, a change began. A faint, ghostly tinge of blue began to color the mud. It deepened until a thin, bright blue trickle of water bubbled up from the ground, the dye of vivid accusation. Ada knelt, touching the blue water, her face a mask of cold fury and intellectual triumph. "It's him," she whispered. "This spring should be feeding her fields. He's diverting the main channel, and the pressure drop is killing every small spring in the basin. He's stealing the water from underground, right beneath our feet." The flow was like a living thing, a vein under the skin of the earth, now visible for all to see. Ada had been working as hard as Eli, mending fences, helping with the stock, and her hands were paying the price. The lariat and the shovel had left her palms blistered, and the rifle practice had rubbed her shoulder raw. She tried to hide it, but Eli noticed the way she winced when she gripped the reins. That evening, he didn't say a word. He just walked to his workbench and returned. He held something out to her. They were a pair of leather work gloves. They weren't new, but they were in perfect condition, the leather dark and supple, the seams meticulously restitched by hand with heavy waxed thread. He had clearly spent time mending them for her.
"My hands are smaller than yours,"
she said, looking at them. "They're Martha's," he said, his voice quiet.
"She wore them for gardening. They're strong. They'll protect your hands from the rope."
Ada looked from the gloves to his face. It was an offering of profound intimacy, a piece of his protected past given to her for a practical, present-day need. It was a gesture of care, not of pity. She slipped her hands into them. The leather was soft on the inside, a perfect, snug fit. She flexed her fingers, the tough hide moving with her. She looked up at him, and for the first time, she gave him a smile that wasn't born of triumph or defiance. It was a genuine, unguarded, wide smile that lit up her entire face, chasing the shadows from her eyes. It was a revelation.
"Thank you, Eli,"
she said. "They're perfect." Their work tracing the water led them directly to Mrs. Finola Dade's ranch. She was a woman in her 60s, with a face like a dried apple, but her eyes were still sharp. She was a holdout, one of the last small ranchers in the basin who hadn't sold to Whitcomb. They found her by her barley field, or what was left of it. The stalks were yellow and brittle, the heads drooping, starved of water. She was trying to dig a small ditch from the dying, blue-tinged spring, her work futile. "Finola," Eli said, tipping his hat.
"Eli,"
she said, leaning on her shovel, her breath coming in ragged gasps.
"Come to watch my last crop die."
"No, ma'am," Eli said. He dismounted. "We're here to help. Ada, show her." For the next 4 hours, the three of them worked, using Ada's knowledge of hydrology and Eli's understanding of the terrain. They found the blockage. It was an old rock slide, one that Eli had always assumed was natural. But Ada saw the drill marks, the remnants of blasting powder. It wasn't natural. It had been made to look natural, diverting the small spring's main flow away from Finola's land and into a channel that fed one of Whitcomb's tributaries. They worked with shovels and a mule, dragging the rocks away, recarving the original channel. It was back-breaking labor. Other ranchers, drawn by the activity, rode over. They watched, at first with suspicion, then with growing interest. When the last rock was moved, the water, still tinged with blue, hesitated for a moment, then poured into the old, dry ditch. It was not a flood, but it was a steady, life-giving stream. It flowed down the channel and began to soak the cracked earth of the barley field. Finola Dade dropped her shovel and put her hands to her face, her shoulders shaking. The other ranchers looked at Eli and Ada with a new respect. They hadn't just brought accusations. They had brought water. The tide of public opinion, so long frozen in fear, was beginning to thaw. The small victory was short-lived. As they were packing their tools, Thomas Vale rode up, his horse lathered. His face was gray with terror. "He knows," Thomas panted, his eyes darting around as if Pike Mallory might spring from the earth. "The word is out in town. Whitcomb's furious about his men being ambushed at the draw. He says he's being robbed. He's sending for a transport wagon of armed men from outside the territory. He's not using local men anymore. He's bringing in enforcers to lock down his claim and secure all witnesses." He looked directly at Ada, then at Eli. "He means to silence everyone, starting with me, and you two, you have to run." The threat settled over Creed Hollow like a shroud. That night, the ranch house felt small and terribly vulnerable. The note Ada had left under the sugar bowl seemed like a grim prophecy. They sat at the table, the map spread out between them, but neither was looking at them. "He's right," Eli said, his voice flat. "You should go. Take my horse. You can be in Prescott by morning. You can give the ledger page to the marshal."
"And what will you do?"
Ada asked, not moving. "This is my land. I don't run."
"I'm not running either,"
she said. "Not this time." She looked down at her hands.
covered by Martha's gloves. When I came here, I just wanted to hurt him. I wanted to ruin him for what he did to Jonah. I wanted him to feel the same loss, to have the land he loved turn to dust, just like our farm did. She paused, then looked up, her gaze meeting his, clear and unflinching. But that's not what Jonah wanted. He didn't write to me about revenge. He wrote to me about this. She tapped the map. He had a plan for a community irrigation channel. He wanted to use the aquifer, but share it. He wanted to build something for everyone. Ruining Whitcomb isn't enough. We have to finish what Jonah started. We have to get that water back for Finola, for Tomas, for all of them. That's how I honor him. Eli stared into her eyes, seeing a strength and a clarity of purpose that mirrored his own stubborn connection to the land. The quiet woman who had arrived with a map and a secret was now a leader. He found himself opening a door inside himself that had been sealed shut for years. "Martha," he said, his voice rough. "She didn't die of a fever. It was malaria, from a bad water mosquito. It came up from the stagnant pools after the creek flow got too low, 2 summers ago. The summer Whitcomb built his first dam." He looked at his own hands, splayed on the table. "I've been alone in this house for 2 years. People think it's the grief. And it is, but it's the cold. Sleeping alone in a cold house. It's like pulling a blanket full of stones over you. Heavy, but no warmth." He looked at her. "I've been carrying that weight. I think I'm tired of being cold." A long silence stretched between them. It was a silence filled with everything they had just admitted. Her grief, his loss, her drive for justice, his weary solitude. They looked at each other, and the gaze held for far longer than was necessary. It was a look that acknowledged the shared danger, the shared confession, and the unspoken, growing bond that was now as real as the table between them. Eli was the first to look away, his throat tight. He cleared it and pointed abruptly at the map, forcing his voice back to business. This symbol Jonah used, the circle with the X through it, and GV3. Ada refocused, pulling her own mind back to the problem. "Gate valve, number 3, she translated. "A main junction, but I could never find where he meant." Eli stared at the map. His eyes traced the line from the symbol, then moved to his own survey map. His fingers stopped. He tapped a small, insignificant mark he himself had drawn years ago. It was labeled Old RR Spur, Mate Hatch. "I know this place," he whispered, a sudden, fierce excitement in his voice. "It's not a hatch. It's a concrete bunker. The railroad built it to manage a steam pipe for their old water tower. But they abandoned the line. It's hidden. It's underground. And it sits." He dragged his finger across the map, connecting Jonah's symbol to his own. "It sits right on top of the main 8-inch pipe they laid in the draw." Ada's eyes widened. "The control." "It's not just a valve," Eli said, the pieces locking into place. "It's the heart. It's the linchpin. If Whitcomb is sending men, that's what they'll be guarding. And it's the one place we can go to shut him down for good." The wind came after dark. It was a moaning, restless wind that howled down from the high mesas, rattling the window panes in their frames and scouring the ranch with invisible hands. It was the kind of wind that frayed a man's nerves, a prelude to violence. Inside the small ranch house, Eli and Ada sat in a tense silence, the map of Gate Valve No. 3, a useless relic on the table between them. Every gust that shook the house made them both start, their eyes meeting over the flickering lamplight. They were not alone in their fear. Earlier that evening, a horse had galloped into the yard, its rider slumped over the saddle in exhaustion. It was Tomas Vale. His face was a mask of sheer terror. "They came to my place," he'd gasped, stumbling into the house. "Mallory's men, they asked about you, about what I said. I ran. I didn't know where else to go." Eli had taken him in without a word, giving him a bedroll by the cold hearth. Now, the 3 of them were a small, besieged island in a sea of darkness and wind. The threat was no longer a distant possibility. It was a certainty, riding on the back of the gale. The first sign of the attack was not a sound, but a smell. A sharp, acrid scent of kerosene carried on the wind, cutting through the familiar smell of dust and sage. Eli was on his feet in an instant, grabbing his Spencer from its pegs on the wall. "They're here," he said, his voice a low, hard rumble. "Ada, douse the lamp. Thomas, stay down, away from the windows." He moved to the window, peering through a crack in the shutters. In the wild, windswept darkness, a single point of light was bobbing towards the hay barn, a lantern. Behind it, he could make out the dark shapes of at least 3 men on horseback, and leading them, a tall, broad-shouldered figure whose silhouette was unmistakable, Pike Mallory. Suddenly, the lantern arced through the air, a comet of fire against the blackness. It smashed against the dry, weathered wood of the barn, and with a sickening whoosh, the wall erupted in a sheet of orange flame. The wind, which had been their tormentor, now became the enemy's greatest weapon, fanning the fire with a furious, hungry roar. "Damn them!" Eli swore, his voice laced with a cold fury. The barn held not just hay, but their winter stores, sacks of flour, beans, and salted meat. It was their survival. "The windmill!" Ada's voice cut through the growing panic. "The main tank is full!" Eli's mind raced. The tank held hundreds of gallons, but it was just a tank. Then his eyes fell on the long, metal watering trough that ran from the base of the tower to the corral. At the end of it was a hand-cranked pump he used when the wind was down. "The pump," he said, a plan forming in his mind. "Ada, the empty water barrels by the well. Get them behind the stable. As fast as you can. I'll hold them off." He burst from the house. The Spencer held low. The fire was already climbing the side of the barn, the crackle and roar a deafening counterpoint to the howling wind. Mallory and his men were sitting on their horses just beyond the firelight, their faces grimly illuminated, watching their handiwork. They were there to destroy, to cripple, to send a message written in ash. Eli ignored them, sprinting for the windmill. He grabbed the heavy canvas fire hose he kept for emergencies and wrestled it onto the spout of the hand pump. He cranked the valve from the main tank, and water surged into the trough. He began to work the pump handle, a desperate, rhythmic motion. A weak, sputtering stream of water shot from the hose. It wasn't a fire brigade's torrent, but it was water. It was a weapon. He aimed the stream at the base of the fire, the water turning to steam as it hit the burning timbers. It was like trying to spit out a forest fire, but he held his ground, the muscles in his back and arms screaming with the effort. On the other side of the yard, Ada worked with a frantic, focused energy. She rolled the heavy barrels one by one, her body straining, using the darkness and the chaos as cover. She moved behind the stable, out of the direct line of sight of Mallory's men, creating a second front in their desperate battle. Thomas Vale, paralyzed by fear, had remained inside. But as he watched Eli fighting the flames alone, something broke inside him. He couldn't fight, but he couldn't hide. He scrambled out the back door, intending to help Ada with the barrels. It was a fatal mistake. One of Mallory's men, circling the property, saw him. "Got one," the man yelled. "It's the hired man who ran his mouth." Before Tomas could react, the man was on him, dragging him out into the open yard. He threw Thomas to the ground at Pike Mallory's feet. "Well, look what we have here," Mallory drawled, dismounting. He loomed over the terrified man. "Thomas, I was hoping to have another talk with you." He drew a long, wicked-looking knife, its blade catching the firelight. Another of his men dismounted, holding a fresh oil lamp, its wick already lit. He intended to make an example of Tomas, right there in the middle of the yard. From her position behind the stable, Ada saw it all. Her heart leaped into her throat. They were too far away. Eli was pinned down by the fire. She was armed with nothing but barrels of water. She didn't panic. Her mind, honed by years of calculation and precision, worked swiftly. She put 2 fingers to her lips. She took a deep breath. A sound cut through the roar of the wind and the fire. A sharp, clear, piercing whistle. 3 short notes. 2 long, 1 short. 3, 2, 1. Eli heard it. The signal. It wasn't a call for help, it was a location. It was a target. He stopped pumping. He dropped the useless hose. He grabbed his Spencer. In one fluid, practiced motion. He raised the rifle to his shoulder. He didn't have time to aim in the traditional sense. He had to trust his instincts, the thousands of hours he had spent reading the wind, judging distance. He saw the scene in a single, frozen tableau, Tomas on the ground, Mallory standing over him, and the second man, holding the lit oil lamp aloft, preparing to set another fire perhaps to the house itself. He didn't aim for Mallory. He didn't aim for the man holding the lamp. He aimed for the light. He let out half a breath. He squeezed the trigger. The Spencer bucked against his shoulder. The shot was a single, sharp crack that was momentarily louder than the fire. Across the yard, the glass chimney of the oil lamp shattered into 1,000 glittering shards. The lamp dropped from the man's suddenly nerveless fingers. Its flaming wick extinguished as it hit the dirt. The yard was plunged back into a chaos of firelight and deep, dancing shadows. For a heartbeat, everyone was frozen. Mallory and his men stared into the darkness where the shot had come from, stunned by its impossible accuracy. In that moment of confusion, Thomas scrambled to his feet and ran, disappearing into the safety of the shadows behind the house. "Find him!" Mallory roared, his voice cracking with fury. "Find him and finish it!" But the moment was lost. The surprise was gone. From the darkness, Eli's voice boomed, hard as granite. "The next one won't miss. Get off my land." A second shot rang out. This one fired into the air. But the message was clear. Mallory hesitated, his face a mask of hate in the flickering firelight. He was a bully, not a soldier. He was here for a quick, brutal act of terror, not a pitched battle against a man who could shoot the light out of his hand from 100 yards in a gale. He snarled a curse, climbed back onto his horse, and with a final, hateful look at the burning barn, he and his men wheeled their horses around and galloped back into the darkness from which they came. The fight with Mallory was over. The fight with the fire had just begun. For the next hour, Eli and Ada worked in a desperate, smoke-choked haze. Eli kept the pump going while Ada and a shaken but resolute Tomas formed a bucket brigade with the barrels, dousing the spreading flames. By the time the last embers were extinguished, the eastern sky was beginning to pale. They had saved the stable and the house, but the hay barn was a smoldering, blackened skeleton. They stood together in the dawn's gray light, exhausted, soot-stained, and smelling of smoke. Half of their winter provisions, their food, their security, was gone. Ada coughed, her throat raw. She walked over to the spot where Thomas had been accosted. She knelt, her eyes scanning the churned-up dirt, and then she saw it. Clear as day in the damp earth where the lantern had fallen was a single, deep boot print. In the center of the heel were 5 small, metal studs, hammered in to form a crude, unmistakable letter, M. "It was him," she said, her voice a hoarse whisper. "We can prove Mallory was here." They gathered at the kitchen table, the rising sun casting long, tired shadows across the floor. The ledger page, the tax stamp, the boot print. Thomas Vale's terror, the pile of evidence, was no longer a theory. It was a case. "We can't wait for his transport wagon," Ada said, her voice firm despite her exhaustion. "We can't win a war against a dozen hired men. This has to be fought with the law now. We have to go to Fort Halston. We have to get this to a U.S. Marshal." Eli looked at Tomas, whose face was still pale with the memory of Mallory's knife. "Tomas, will you tell the Marshal what you saw, what you told us?" Tomas wrung his hands, his gaze dropping to the floor. He was a simple man, caught in a deadly game,
But he had seen the fire in his old boss's yard. He had felt the cold steel of Mallory's threat, and he had heard the bullet that had saved his life. He raised his head, and a spark of defiance lit his tired eyes. "They tried to burn you out. Eli, they were going to kill me." "Yes," he said, his voice gaining strength. "I'll tell him. If you can promise he'll protect my family." "We will," Eli said, his voice a solemn vow. The decision was made. The sun was barely up, but there was no time for rest. Eli began to gather the evidence, his movements precise. He carefully wrapped the fragile ledger page and the tax stamp in an oilskin pouch. He added his own hand-drawn copy of Jonah's map, marking the location of Vanchan, so 3. Ada went to her trunk. She retrieved the small, leather-bound journal, Jonah's notes. From the very back, tucked into a hidden sleeve, she pulled out a folded, brittle piece of paper. It was Jonah's last letter to her, the one with the torn edge and the broken W seal. It was filled with his hopes for the irrigation project, but also his growing fears about Silas Whitcomb. It was the desperate plea of a man who knew he was in mortal danger. She added it to the oilskin pouch. It was no longer just evidence. It was his testimony. They packed quickly. A silent, efficient team. A canteen, a bag of hardtack, and the precious oilskin pouch. They were fugitives now, running not from the law, but toward it. As Eli went outside to saddle his last horse, Ada stood for a moment in the doorway of his bedroom. She had slept there for several nights, a small island of safety in a hostile world. The room was sparse, masculine, defined by his absence as much as his presence. Her eyes were drawn to the bed. The single blanket was thrown back, and the indentation of her own head was still on the pillow. The other side of the bed, his side, was flat and undisturbed. The blanket lay smooth, a wide, empty expanse of gray wool, a silent testament to his solitude. She found herself looking at that empty space, and a feeling she couldn't name, a complex ache of sorrow and a strange, unfamiliar longing, tightened in her chest. For a fleeting moment, she imagined it not being empty. She imagined a world without fear, without fire, without the constant threat of violence, a world where two lonely people could simply find warmth against the cold. Eli came back inside, his spurs jingling softly on the wooden floor. He saw her standing in the doorway, saw the direction of her gaze, saw the flicker of vulnerability in her eyes. He stopped. The air between them grew thick, charged with all the unspoken words of the last few days. He understood the question she was silently asking, the weariness that went bone deep. He didn't step forward. He didn't offer a false promise or an easy comfort. Instead, he held her gaze for a long moment, his own eyes filled with a deep, quiet respect. Then, he took a small step back, reached out, and gently closed the bedroom door, shutting the image of the bed away from both of them. The soft click of the latch was not a rejection. It was a promise. It was an acknowledgement that the boundary between them still stood, a line he would not cross while she was exhausted and afraid. It was a silent vow that whatever might grow between them would be a choice, made in the light, not a surrender, made in the dark. "It's time to ride," he said, his voice soft. The ride to Fort Halston was a silent, grim affair. They were not traveling the main road, a wide, dusty artery that was easy to follow and easy to watch. Instead, Eli led them through a maze of forgotten game trails and dry arroyos, a path that existed only in his mind. He was in his element here, a ghost moving through a landscape that was hostile to all others. He pointed to a high, sun-baked ridge in the distance, its crest shimmering in the heat. "Calico Rise," he said, his voice a low murmur that was barely carried on the breeze. "The main road cuts right through that pass. Whitcomb will have men there. 2, maybe 3. They'll have a spyglass and a clear view for 5 miles in either direction." They skirted the rise, staying low in a winding canyon that smelled of juniper and hot rock.
It added hours to their journey, but it kept them invisible. They were hunted animals, and Eli Creed knew how a hunted animal must travel to survive. Fort Halston wasn't a military fort anymore. It was a dusty, sprawling territorial town that had grown up around the old cavalry post. It was the seat of the law for 3 counties, and its heart was a squat, formidable-looking stone building with barred windows that housed the U.S.N. Marshal's office. They left Tomas and the horse at the livery, instructing him to stay out of sight. Then, weary and covered in trail dust, Eli and Ada stepped into the marshal's office. The man behind the desk was not the marshal himself, but his deputy, a man named Delaney. He was in his late 40s, with a weathered face, a drooping mustache, and eyes the color of dishwater. They were the most tired eyes Ada had ever seen. He looked up from his paperwork, his expression one of profound and unending boredom. "Help you?" he asked, his voice flat. "We need to report a crime." "Marshal," Eli said, his voice respectful but firm. "Deputy Marshal," Delaney corrected him, his tone unchanged. "And a crime in the Red Kestrel Basin. I presume, let me guess, cattle rustling, a card game gone sour." "Water theft," Ada said, stepping forward. "And conspiracy to defraud the federal government, and murder." Delaney's tired eyes flickered with a brief spark of interest, which he quickly extinguished. He leaned back in his chair, the wood groaning in protest. "That's a whole docket of trouble. Who are you accusing?" "Silas Whitcomb," Eli said. The deputy marshal sighed, a long, weary exhalation of breath. He ran a hand over his face. "Son," he said, his voice laced with the kind of pity reserved for fools and children. "Let me give you some advice. You go home. You dig your well a little deeper. You pray for rain. You do not, under any circumstances, pick a fight with Silas Whitcomb. Men like him don't get arrested. Their paperwork gets misplaced. Witnesses get forgetful. The world just seems to work out in their favor." "Not this time," Ada said, her voice sharp as flint. She untied the oilskin pouch and laid its contents on his desk, her movements precise and deliberate. "This is a ledger page from his own book, detailing a payment to Judge Alistair Corby." Delaney glanced at it, unimpressed. "Hearsay? A forgery, for all I know?" "This is a map of his illegal diversion system, drawn by my brother, Jonah Linley, a hydrologist." She continued, her voice steady. "The same brother who was found drowned in one of Whitcomb's ditches 2 months ago." The marshal's expression didn't change, but his eyes lingered on the map. "And this," Ada said, placing the last damning piece of evidence on the desk, "is a federal tax stamp, which we believe to be a forgery, used to legitimize a fraudulent land claim that secured his water rights. A federal crime. Deputy Marshal, one that happens to fall directly under your jurisdiction." Delaney stopped leaning back. He picked up the tax stamp, holding it up to the light, his tired eyes suddenly sharp and focused. He ran his thumb over the intricate engraving, then pulled a magnifying glass from his drawer. He studied the stamp for a long, silent minute. He compared it to another stamp from a folder on his desk. "Well, I'll be damned," he whispered, more to himself than to them. "The watermark is wrong. It's a clever fake, but it's a fake." He looked up at them, and, for the first time, he seemed to see them not as naive ranchers, but as serious players in a dangerous game. The local corruption was one thing, a messy, tangled web he couldn't hope to untangle. But a federal offense was a different animal entirely. It was a direct challenge to his authority, to the law he represented. It was a thread he could pull. "This is good," he said, his voice losing its bored tone. "The map is compelling, the ledger is motive, the stamp is the key. It's enough to get a federal judge to issue a warrant. I can take a few men out there, and we can search gate valve number 3. He paused, his gaze hardening. "But a warrant to search is not a warrant to arrest. To arrest Whitcomb and Mallory for conspiracy. I need more. I need a living witness." Someone who has heard them with their own ears. Admit to the crime. Eli looked at Ada. We have Thomas Vale. A scared ranch hand, Delaney scoffed. Whitcomb's lawyers will tear him to shreds on the stand. They'll say he's a disgruntled employee with a grudge. No, I need something better. I need one of them to confess. An idea, audacious and incredibly dangerous, began to form in Ada's mind. Confess they will, she said, her voice low. Pike Mallory is arrogant. He's a bully who thinks he's untouchable. Men like that, they like to brag. The Juniper Saloon was the darkest, dirtiest watering hole in Fort Halston, a place where prospectors, drifters, and hired men drank away their pay. It smelled of stale beer, sweat, and desperation. And it was, according to Thomas Vale, Pike Mallory's favorite place to hold court when he was in town. The plan was a trap, baited with the one thing Pike Mallory couldn't resist the chance to feel powerful. Thomas Vale, his face pale with sweat despite the cool evening, walked into the saloon. He looked every bit the terrified man he was. He walked to the bar and ordered a whiskey, his hands shaking so badly he had to use both of them to lift the glass. At a table in the corner, Pike Mallory sat with two of his brutish enforcers. He saw Thomas, and a slow, cruel smile spread across his face. He nudged one of his men. The trap was set. Across the room, a new card dealer was setting up a game of faro. She was a plain-looking woman, dressed in a drab gray dress, with her hair pulled back in a severe bun. She wore a green eyeshade that cast her face in shadow. She handled the cards with a mechanical, almost clumsy efficiency, her movements stiff. No one gave her a second glance. It was Ada, and in the dark, dusty loft above the saloon, a single eye watched the scene through a crack in the floorboards. Eli lay flat on his stomach, a small lady's hand mirror in his hand, its surface polished to a high shine. Mallory's man swaggered over to the bar. "Thomas," he said, his voice dripping with false friendliness. "The boss wants a word with you." Thomas looked like a cornered rabbit. He allowed himself to be led to Mallory's table. "Heard you had some bad luck out at the Creed place," Mallory said, leaning back in his chair. "Fires are a terrible thing." I ain't looking for trouble, Mr. Mallory," Thomas stammered. "No, I expect you're looking for an opportunity," Mallory said, his eyes glittering. "I hear Creed and that woman rode out this morning, in a hurry. Now, a smart man might think they've run off. A smarter man might think he's got some information to sell. Information about, say, where they might have gone." This was the bait. Thomas swallowed hard, playing his part. "Information costs money." Mallory laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "It surely does." He gestured to the faro table. "Why don't you boys go play a few hands? Give Thomas and me a moment to negotiate." His two men sauntered over to Ada's table and sat down, throwing a few coins on the layout. Ada barely looked at them, her hands methodically dealing the cards from the box. Her ears, however, were straining, filtering out the noise of the saloon, focusing on the conversation at the corner table. Up in the loft, Eli saw the men move. He angled his mirror, catching the light from a sconce on the wall and flashing a tiny, bright signal 2 short flashes towards a darkened window at the back of the marshal's office across the street. It was the signal the targets were in position. Under the table, hidden by the long tablecloth, Ada had a small piece of slate and a stick of charcoal. As Mallory began to talk, her left hand, the one not dealing the cards, began to move, scribbling a frantic, coded shorthand. "So," Mallory said, leaning forward, his voice a low, conspiratorial growl. "What did they find in the draw?" They have maps," Thomas said, his voice trembling. "And a page from your ledger." Mallory's smile tightened. "They have nothing, just the ramblings of a dead man. We have the only thing that matters. We have the water." He took a long drink of whiskey, his arrogance swelling. "That little brother of hers, he was smart. I'll give him that. He found gate valve number 3, but he didn't know what it could do. He leaned closer to Thomas, his voice dropping to a boastful whisper that Ada could just barely hear. "We finished the expansion last night. That new pipe, it can suck Rook Fork Creek bone dry in a single night. By the time that fool Marshall gets a judge to sign a piece of paper, there'll be nothing left to find but a dry hole and a lot of empty pipe." Ada's hand flew across the slate. She had it. A direct confession. Eli, watching from above, saw Mallory lean back, his chest puffed out with pride. He flashed the mirror again, 3 short flashes. The trap is sprung. The front doors of the Juniper Saloon burst open. Deputy Marshal Delaney stood there, flanked by 2 armed deputies. "Pike Mallory," he bellowed. "You and your men are under arrest by the authority of the United States Marshal's Service." The saloon erupted into chaos. Men shouted. Chairs were knocked over. Mallory's 2 men at the card table jumped to their feet, their hands going for their guns. But Delaney's deputies were faster. They had their pistols leveled before the men could clear leather. "Don't try it!" one of them yelled. Pike Mallory, however, was a cornered rat. He didn't surrender. He kicked the table over, sending bottles and glasses crashing to the floor. In the confusion, he drew his own pistol and fired a single, wild shot into the ceiling, raining plaster down on the panicked crowd. It was the distraction he needed. He dove for a side door, the one that led to the back alley. Eli saw his escape and was already moving, dropping from the loft into a pile of hay in the adjoining stable. Delaney's men subdued Mallory's 2 enforcers, cuffing them amidst the wreckage of the saloon. Ada slipped away from the faro table, the precious slate board clutched in her hand. "Where's Mallory?" Delaney demanded, his eyes sweeping the chaotic room. "At the back alley!" Ada shouted. Delaney ran for the side door, but it was too late. They heard the thunder of a galloping horse fading into the night. Pike Mallory had escaped. A half-hour later, they were back in Delaney's office. The 2 captured men were silent and sullen in a holding cell. The news of the raid, however, had traveled faster than a telegraph. A rider had been seen leaving Fort Halston at a full gallop, heading east, towards Whitcomb's ranch. "He knows," Delaney said, slamming a fist on his desk. "Whitcomb knows we're coming. He'll have that transport wagon of his at the valve site before we are. They'll destroy everything. The pumps, the records, the valve itself. By the time I get a judge out of bed and get a warrant signed, our evidence will be at the bottom of a collapsed mine shaft." He paced the office like a caged wolf. The law was a slow, deliberate machine. Whitcomb's brand of justice was swift and final. "You can't wait for the warrant," Ada said, her voice urgent. "I have to," Delaney growled. "I'm a lawman. I go in with a signed order, or I don't go in at all." "Then let us go," Eli said, stepping forward from the shadows. "He's running towards Windmill Gulch. That's the fastest way to the valve site. Ada and I know a faster way. Through the water channels. We can get there ahead of him. We can't stop a dozen armed men, but we can slow them down. We can delay them long enough for you to arrive with your warrant." Delaney stopped pacing. He looked at the hard-bitten rancher and the determined woman. They were not lawmen. They were not bound by his rules. They were driven by something more personal. "It's suicide," the deputy marshal said, but there was a grudging respect in his voice. "It's a chance," Ada corrected him. "It's the only chance we have." Delaney stared at them for a long moment, the fate of the entire basin hanging in the balance. He made his decision. "All right," he said, unlocking his gun cabinet. He handed Eli a box of cartridges for the Spencer. "I'll ride for the judge's house and get my warrant. You 2, you ride for the Gulch. I don't want to know what you do. Just keep that evidence intact until I get there. And Creed." Eli paused at the door. "Try not to get yourselves killed before I can make a proper arrest." The sky broke open as they cleared the last ridge of the foothills and entered the wide, desolate mouth of Windmill Gulch. The air, moments before, hot and still, had turned a sickly, bruised color.
The smell of ozone and wet dust filled their lungs. Then the first drop hit, cold and heavy as a bullet. Within a minute, the world was gone, erased by a vertical deluge of driving, icy rain. It wasn't a gentle shower. It was a high-desert cloudburst, a torrent that turned the dry, cracked earth into a slick, running river of red mud. The wind howled, whipping the water into horizontal sheets that stung their faces and blinded them.
"So, we can't ride in this,"
Eli shouted over the roar of the storm.
"The gulch will flash flood. We'll be trapped."
He grabbed Ada's rein, pulling her horse off the main trail, which was already beginning to fill with a churning, muddy torrent. He led her up a steep, rocky incline, his face a mask of concentration as he navigated the treacherous terrain purely by memory. Ada could see nothing, trusting only the dark shape of his back as he moved ahead of her. He stopped at a place that seemed no different from any other rock face, a curtain of falling water. He dismounted and pushed aside a heavy curtain of overgrown salt cedar. Behind it was a dark opening, a small, low-roofed shed, built of rough-hewn timber and corrugated tin, was tucked into an alcove in the rock. It was an old maintenance shed for the towering, skeletal windmill that loomed over them, its blades spinning wildly, uselessly, in the gale.
"In here,"
he yelled, pulling the horses into the relative shelter of the overhang. The shed was tiny, not much bigger than a closet, but it was dry. It smelled of old grease, damp earth, and something animal, as if coyotes had used it for shelter. In the corner sat a small, rusted pot-bellied stove with a stack of dry juniper wood beside it. A single, narrow cot with a threadbare blanket was pushed against the far wall. They stumbled inside, the roar of the storm instantly muffled to a deafening drumbeat on the tin roof. They were soaked to the bone, the cold desert water having pierced their clothes in seconds. Now that they were out of the wind, the cold began to set in, a deep, penetrating chill. Ada leaned against the wall, pushing her wet hair back from her face, but she couldn't stop the shiver that seized her. It started in her shoulders and quickly racked her entire body, her teeth chattering so hard she had to clench her jaw. Eli didn't hesitate. He was in motion, his pragmatism overriding any social formality. He struck a lucifer, the flare illuminating his grim face as he lit the kindling in the stove. "You're freezing," he stated. It wasn't a question. "That cold will kill you faster than Mallory." He unstrapped his bedroll and pulled out his heavy, wool-lined duster, the one he'd left behind in his haste. He held it out. "Get out of that wet shirt. At least, put this on." He turned his back to her, offering a blunt, practical privacy as he busied himself with the fire, coaxing the small flames to life. Ada's fingers were numb, fumbling with the buttons of her blouse. The wool duster was incredibly heavy, but as she wrapped it around her, she was enveloped in the scent of him leather, sage, and the faint, clean smell of the man himself. It was warmer than the fire. He turned back, handing her a tin cup of water from his canteen. His fingers brushed hers as she took it. His hand was rough as granite, but it was radiating a life-giving warmth that startled her. The brief, accidental touch was more intimate than a lingering caress. It was a silent, physical fact he was warm, and she was cold. They sat in the small, cramped space, the stove beginning to cast a pulsing red glow. The world outside was a roaring, watery chaos. Inside, the only sounds were the crackle of the juniper wood and the relentless drumming of the rain on the roof. They were trapped, suspended in time. The hunt momentarily paused. The silence stretched, filled by the shared danger and the growing warmth. "I swore an oath," Ada said, her voice quiet, almost lost in the storm. She was staring into the flames, her face pale in the firelight. "After Jonah died, I stood at his graveside. It was just a pile of rocks we put there, not a real grave. I swore that I would see Silas Whitcomb ruined, that I would take from him what he took from me. I wanted him to see his land dry up and blow away. I wanted him to feel that,
that cold. Eli nodded slowly, his own gaze fixed on the fire. He knew that cold. "I told you about Martha," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I told you it was malaria, but I didn't tell you about the house. After she was gone, this place—" He motioned, as if to encompass his entire life. "It wasn't just quiet. It was empty. It's a different kind of cold. You get into bed at night, and the blankets, they feel heavy, like a pile of stones. They press you down, but they never, ever get warm." He looked at his own hands, splayed on his knees. "I've been sleeping under those stones for 2 years. Ada, I'd forgotten what it felt like to be warm." His confession hung in the air, a raw, painful, and beautiful thing. He had given her his deepest truth, a vulnerability he had likely never voiced to another living soul. Ada looked at his hand, the one resting on his knee. It was a strong, scarred, capable hand. A long, white scar, puckered and old, ran from his knuckle to his wrist. A rope burn, or a knife cut, a mark of the hard life he'd lived. Slowly, almost hesitantly, she reached out. She didn't grab his hand. She just lightly traced the line of the scar with the tip of her index finger. Eli flinched. It was a sharp, involuntary tensing of every muscle in his body, a reflex born of years of solitude, of guarding himself against all pain and all contact. His eyes shot to hers, wide and startled. He was exposed. But he didn't pull his hand away. He held his breath, and he let her touch him. He let her see the scar, let her feel the rough texture of his skin, and under her fingertip, he felt the muscle in his hand slowly, consciously, relax. The trust was complete. The air in the tiny shed was electric, charged with the rain, the fire, and this single fragile point of contact. The roar of the storm faded to a distant hum. He turned his hand over, his palm facing up, a silent offering. She met his gaze, and her own hand settled into his. He leaned in. It was a slow, deliberate movement. This was not a moment of sudden, desperate passion. It was a question, asked without words. She leaned forward, meeting him halfway, her eyes closing. The first kiss was a hesitant, gentle discovery. It was just the soft pressure of his lips against hers, tasting of the rain, the smoke, and a profound, aching loneliness. It was a comfort, a grounding. Then a shudder ran through him, a release of all the tension, the grief, the years of cold. The kiss deepened. It became a slow, consuming fire, a desperate need for the warmth and life that existed in each other, a silent promise that neither of them was alone in the storm. It was a kiss that held all the fear of the night and all the hope of the morning. He broke it, pulling back just an inch, his forehead resting against hers. His breathing was ragged, his eyes dark and unreadable in the firelight. "Ada," he whispered, his voice thick and rough. "Are you sure?" It was the question of a man who would not take, only accept. A man who had been given nothing but loss for so long that this offering of grace was almost too much to bear. Ada didn't hesitate. She lifted her hand, her fingers, still cold, touching his rough cheek. She looked directly into his eyes, her own gaze clear and fiercely alive. "I've spent my whole life needing someone to save me," she said, her voice steady and sure. "My father, from the drought. Jonah, from the failure of the farm. I came here looking for a guide to save my brother's honor. I don't need saving anymore. Eli." Her thumb brushed his lower lip. "I'm not a victim, and I'm not a child. I'm choosing this. I'm choosing you." A slow smile, the first truly relaxed smile he had ever seen from her, touched the corners of her mouth. It was part joke, part command, and all honest, unadulterated truth. "And," she whispered, her voice a mix of humor and simple fact, "you're sleeping on my side tonight." Eli didn't move for a long, endless second. He just stared at her, his eyes drinking her in. He saw the strength, the resolve, and the frank, open invitation. He saw a woman who was his equal in every way. The last of the stones he'd been carrying crumbled to dust. He didn't need to speak. His eyes gave her his answer, a promise of loyalty, of protection, of a shared path forward. He released her hand and reached for the single, threadbare blanket on the cot. He didn't pull her to him, but instead, with a single, economic movement, he sat down on the edge of the cot and drew the heavy blanket over them both. Pulling her close against his side, he wrapped his arms around her, sharing his warmth, shielding her from the cold that still clung to her. The rain hammered a relentless, frantic rhythm on the tin roof, but inside the tiny shed, the world was reduced to the crackle of the stove and the steady, shared breathing of two people. Outside, the wind screamed through the high gulch, and the massive blades of the windmills spun in the darkness, a dark, lonely sentinel against the raging storm. In the dim, red glow of the fire, two solitary silhouettes leaned against each other, their shadows merging on the rough wooden wall. Finally, still. Finally, warm. When the first gray light of dawn filtered through the grimy window, the rain had stopped. The air outside was washed clean, cold and sharp. Ada woke first, warm for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. She was tucked against Eli, his arms still securely around her, his breathing deep and even. The fire in the stove had burned down to glowing embers. She lay still, listening to the quiet. The storm had passed. The vulnerability of the night was gone, replaced by a new, solid, and quiet resolve. They had to move. Eli's eyes opened, and he looked at her. There was no awkwardness, no hesitation. There was only a calm, shared understanding. He gave a slight nod, and they began to move, dressing in the cold morning air, preparing themselves for the fight that was to come. They were two different people than the ones who had entered the shed. They were no longer alone. The dawn broke cold and clean, the air sharp with the scent of wet sage and ozone. The storm had scoured the landscape, leaving the red rocks gleaming and the ground a slick of mud. Windmill Gulch was quiet, save for the steady drip of water and the groan of the massive wind tower above them, its blades still turning in the unsettled air. Eli and Ada moved with a silent, synchronized purpose, their actions flowing with the unspoken understanding forged in the maintenance shed. They were no longer two separate people. They were a single, functioning unit. They approached the concrete bunker that Eli had identified Gate Valve 3. It was squat and windowless, its heavy iron hatch secured with a thick padlock. They couldn't get inside, not without noise. "We have to be sure," Ada whispered, her voice barely audible. She unwrapped the burlap they had used to muzzle the horses, the fabric still damp from the rain. She pressed it against the cold concrete wall of the bunker, then pressed her ear to the cloth, creating a crude stethoscope. She motioned for Eli to do the same on the opposite wall. They listened, moving inch by inch. The world was reduced to the sound of their own breathing and the faint, subterranean song of the earth. At first, nothing. Then, Ada froze. She waved Eli over. He pressed his ear to the spot. He heard it. A faint, high-pitched hiss. A vibration. It was the sound of an immense volume of water being forced through a constricted space at high pressure. It was the sound of a leak. "It's here," Ada breathed, tapping the floor plates just inside the hatch. "The main valve chamber is beneath the floor, right under us." Before Eli could reply, a new sound cut through the morning stillness. It was not the high, clear call of Delaney's bugle. It was the heavy, rhythmic splash of horses moving through mud. Eli pulled Ada back into the deep shadows of the rock alcove, his hand instinctively going to the Spencer carbine. 4 riders appeared, silhouetted against the pale morning sky. They were not lawmen. They were hard men, dressed in mismatched gear, their faces grim and unfamiliar. Hired enforcers, and leading them, his face a mask of thunder, was Pike Mallory. He was not running. He was advancing. He carried a sledgehammer strapped to his saddle, and one of his men had a heavy oilskin satchel that looked suspiciously like it held blasting powder. "He's not running," Eli whispered, his voice hard as iron. "He's here to destroy the evidence. He's going to blow the valve." "And the records," Ada added, her mind racing. "The real records must be in there with the valve." Mallory dismounted. Pulling a heavy key from his pocket, he unlocked the padlock and threw the iron hatch open with a loud clang. "Get in there," he snarled at his men. "I want it all gone. Gut the place. Burn every piece of paper you find. Then we set the charges on the main valve. When we're done, this whole bunker is going to be a collapsed hole filled with mud." Two of his men grabbed their tools and disappeared into the dark. Square opening. The third man stayed on his horse, a rifle across his lap, scanning the perimeter. Mallory stood by the hatch, directing them. They were outnumbered, 4-2. A direct fight was suicide. "Delay," Eli mouthed. Ada looked at him, then at the massive windmill tower looming over them. She saw the spinning blades, the heavy pump rod descending into the earth, and the main brake lever at the tower's base. She had studied this machine. She knew how it worked. She pointed to the tower, then to the bunker. Eli's eyes followed her gesture. He didn't understand her plan, but he understood her expression. He nodded. "Go," while Eli created a small diversion, dislodging a rock on the far side of the gulch to draw the guards' attention. Ada slipped from the shadows. She moved like a ghost, her boots making no sound on the wet rock, until she reached the latticework base of the wind tower. She grabbed the heavy cast-iron brake lever. It was designed to slow the blades in a high wind, but Ada didn't just want to slow it. She put her entire weight into it, pulling it down with all her strength. The effect was instantaneous and violent. There was a high-pitched, metallic scream from the gearbox far above them, a sound of metal grinding against metal in a way it was never intended to. The massive blades shuddered, fighting the mechanical force, and the heavy pump rod that plunged into the earth seized in its housing. Inside the bunker, Mallory's men yelled in surprise. The jammed pump, connected to the same intricate underground system, sent a concussive shudder, a water hammer back through the pipes. The flow of water didn't just stop. It surged backward. A violent reversal of pressure that slammed against the very valve they were trying to dismantle. A geyser of muddy water erupted from a pressure release joint inside the bunker, spraying the men. "What in hell was that?" Mallory roared, peering into the smoky darkness of the bunker. The guard on horseback was distracted, his attention fixed on the groaning, shuddering windmill. This was Eli's chance. He was 100 yards away, hidden in the rocks. He raised the Spencer. He saw the bunker, the men confused, and the single large oil lantern they had hung on a hook just inside the hatch, casting greasy shadows. He didn't aim for a man. He aimed for the small, metal latch holding the lantern's chain. He breathed out. He squeezed. The rifle cracked. The bullet, precise and true, shattered the latch. The heavy lantern dropped. It hit the concrete floor and burst, spraying burning oil across a pile of greasy rags and tarpaulins. A thick, acrid, black smoke billowed from the open hatch, as if hell itself were breathing out. Shouts of panic and pain came from within. The men, blinded and choking, stumbled out, rubbing their eyes, their plan to destroy the evidence forgotten. "It's Creed!" the guard yelled, finally realizing they were under attack. He raised his rifle. But before he could fire, a new sound echoed down the gulch. Cutting through the chaos, it was high, clear, and triumphant. A bugle call. "Delaney," Eli said, reloading the Spencer. Pike Mallory heard it too. The smoke, the jammed pump, the arrival of the law, it was all collapsing. His face contorted in a mask of primal fury. He had to escape, but he needed leverage. He saw a figure running toward them from the direction of the bugle call. It was Thomas Vale, his face alight with hope, running ahead of the main posse to find Eli.
Mallory moved like a viper. He burst through the choking smoke and grabbed Tomas, yanking him off his feet. He shoved the barrel of his pistol against Tomas's temple, dragging him into the open. "Creed, Delaney, anyone!" Mallory bellowed, his voice raw. stand down, or I'll scatter his brains all over this mud."
Eli froze, his rifle half raised. He was too far away for a clean shot. Delaney and his deputies, just cresting the rise, reined in their horses, their faces grim.
"Let him go! Mallory!" Delaney shouted. "It's over! It's over when I say it's over!" Pike snarled, his eyes wild. "You lower your weapons, all of you. Give me a horse and clear the pass."
From the rocks above them, a voice, calm and clear, cut through the tense standoff. "He's right, Mr. Mallory," Ada said. "It is over." Mallory's head snapped up. He couldn't see her. She was hidden in the rocks, perched directly above him. In her hands, she held her lariat, the rope still damp and heavy from the rain. She had been swinging it, slowly, building momentum. She had learned on a dry fence post. She would prove it on a desperate man. She cast the loop. It was not a gentle toss. It was a fast, hard throw. The wet, heavy rope sailed down, uncoiling with a hiss. It wasn't a perfect loop over his head. It was better. The loop and the heavy end of the rope wrapped around Pike's arm and wrist, the wet fibers biting into his skin. "Now!" she screamed. She didn't wait. She braced her feet and yanked back with all her strength. The sudden, violent force ripped Mallory's arm sideways. His pistol fired, the shot going harmlessly into the sky. The gun flew from his nerveless grasp, landing in a deep pool of mud. Tomas scrambled free. Eli was already moving, sprinting from his cover, but he didn't go for Mallory. He trusted Delaney to handle the disarmed man. Eli ran for the smoking bunker. He dove through the acrid smoke, his eyes watering, and landed on the slick floor. He ignored the burning rags and the damaged tools. He went straight to the spot where Ada had heard the leak, kicked aside a floor grate, and plunged his arm into a hidden recess beneath the main floor. His fingers brushed against a cold, tin-lined box. He dragged it out. It was heavy. He tore it open. It wasn't just copies. It was everything. The real bribe ledgers, the signed contracts with Judge Corby, and something new. A master schematic, a blueprint that showed the truth this valve wasn't just stealing water for Whitcomb's ranch. It was a diversion point. It was rerouting the basin's entire aquifer, billions of gallons, through a secret tunnel, miles away, to fill a massive, private, and unlisted reservoir. The Midspar Reservoir. This wasn't just theft. It was the creation of a private empire. As Eli emerged from the smoke, blinking in the daylight, holding the tin box aloft, two things happened at once. First, a lone rider crested the hill, cantering his magnificent horse through the mud, his posture radiating immaculate, untouched authority. Silas Whitcomb. He had come to oversee the destruction of his enemies, not to be a part of their triumph.
"Marshal Delaney!" Whitcomb boomed, his voice like cold steel. "I am glad you are here. Arrest these terrorists. They have attacked my men, trespassed on my property, and destroyed my equipment. I will see them hang for this."
Deputy Marshal Delaney dismounted, his boots sinking into the mud. He walked past the sputtering, captive Pike Mallory. He walked past the cheering, weeping Thomas Vale. He walked right up to Whitcomb, and he took the tin box from Eli's hand. He opened it. He looked at the Midspar Reservoir map. He looked at the signed bribe ledger. He looked up at the most powerful man in the basin.
"Silas Whitcomb."
Delaney's voice was clear, carrying across the gulch. "By the authority of the United States Territorial Court, you are under arrest for conspiracy, bribery of a federal judge, and the systematic theft of federal water resources." Behind him, the crowd that had followed him, Finola Dade, and a dozen other ranchers let out a collective, disbelieving gasp. And then the second thing happened. The jammed windmill, the reversed pressure, the damage from Mallory's men, it was too much. Deep within the bunker, something gave way. With a sound like a cannon shot, the main diversion gate burst from its housing. It was not a leak, it was a liberation. A massive, churning torrent of crystal-clear water, the water that had been stolen for years, exploded from the side of the bunker. It poured into the old, dry, waiting channel of Rook Fork Creek. The water was free. A stunned silence held for a single second, and then Finola Dade let out a whoop of joy. The other ranchers roared, a sound of pure, unbridled relief. They cheered, they wept, they rushed to the edge of the new, fast-flowing river. In the midst of the chaos, as Delaney's men were cuffing a stunned and silent Whitcomb, Pike Mallory acted. He was a cornered animal, and he saw one last, desperate chance. He headbutted the deputy holding him, broke free, and ran. He didn't run for a horse. He ran for the one place he thought he would have the advantage. He ran for the massive, looming windmill tower. He grabbed the steel lattice ladder and began to climb, scrambling upward like a spider. Ada, standing near the bunker, saw him. This was the man who had overseen her brother's murder. This was the man who had terrorized the basin. This was not over. "He's mine," she said, and she sprinted after him, grabbing the ladder and beginning the long, dizzying climb. Eli saw her go. He saw the cold fury in her eyes. He saw Mallory, 100 feet above her, stopping to look down. Pike was trapped, but he was also desperate. Eli didn't follow her up the ladder. He was a scout. He knew how to trap an animal. He ran to the other side of the tower, his eyes tracking their ascent, cutting off the only possible avenue of escape. He was closing the net. The wind on the windmill platform was a physical thing, a shrieking, invisible beast that tore at their clothes and tried to rip them from their precarious perch. The rain-slicked steel deck, 100 feet above the churning mud of the gulch, was treacherous as black ice. Below, the world was a chaotic panorama of shouting men, flowing water, and the first rays of a sun breaking through the bruised clouds. But up here, in the heart of the gale, the world was reduced to this single, swaying platform and the groaning, grinding gears of the damaged machinery. Pike Mallory stood with his back to the massive gearbox, his chest heaving, his face a mask of cornered desperation. He was a big man, but up here, against the vast, empty sky, he seemed diminished, a creature of brute force lost in a world of complex machinery he didn't understand. Ada reached the top of the ladder, her knuckles white, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She pulled herself onto the platform, her boots ringing on the steel mesh. She and Mallory faced each other, separated by 10 feet of treacherous, open space. The massive, 12-foot blades of the windmill swept past them with a sound like a giant scythe, a rhythmic, menacing whoosh that punctuated the howling of the wind. "Should have stayed on the ground, little lady," Mallory snarled, his voice barely audible over the gale. "This ain't no place for you." "This is my place now," Ada said, her voice calm and clear, cutting through the noise. She stood her ground, balanced and ready. She was not the same woman who had stepped off the stagecoach weeks ago. The fear was gone, burned away by fire and resolve. Mallory took a step toward her, his heavy boots skidding slightly on the wet steel. He sneered, his confidence returning as he looked at her smaller frame. "You think you've won. You think a piece of paper and a lucky shot changes anything. The law will get tired. The water will still flow to the man with the deepest pockets." He took another step. "You're just a woman, playing a man's game you can't possibly understand." Ada didn't move. A small, cold smile touched her lips. "You're wrong, Mr. Mallory," she said, her voice ringing with the force of an irrefutable truth. "I understand this better than you ever will. You see a machine that makes you rich. I see the heart of the basin. You aren't in a man's world." She gestured to the spinning blades, to the groaning pump, to the life-giving water now thundering through the gulch below. "You're in my world." "And I," she declared, her voice rising over the storm, am the Water Keeper." The title, self-bestowed and earned in fire, hung in the air. For a moment, Mallory was taken aback by her sheer, unshakable conviction. Then his face contorted in a mask of pure rage. With a guttural roar, he lunged at her, his hands outstretched like claws, intending to throw her from the platform. Ada didn't retreat. She sidestepped, a dancer's move, her body fluid and precise. As he blundered past her, she reached out and grabbed a secondary lever near the main shaft, the auxiliary brake, a small, rarely used mechanism for emergency maintenance. She yanked it hard. The effect was not a smooth stop. It was a violent, mechanical seizure. A set of iron brake shoes slammed into the secondary flywheel. The entire tower shuddered. The massive blades, still fighting the main brake, lurched to a sudden, jarring halt with a sound like a breaking bone. The abrupt stop threw Mallory completely off balance. He had been lunging forward, expecting to meet resistance. Instead, his world jerked sideways. He stumbled, his arms windmilling wildly as he fought for purchase on the slick steel. His momentum carried him toward the edge of the platform. He cried out, a sound of pure terror, as his heavy boots slipped out from under him. He didn't go over, just as he was about to fall. A strong hand grabbed the back of his collar, yanking him back from the brink. It wasn't Ada. It was Deputy Marshal Delaney, who had climbed the ladder right behind her. He hauled the sputtering, terrified man to his feet and, with a swift, brutal efficiency, snapped a pair of iron cuffs onto his wrists. The trap was closed. Down in the gulch, the human drama was reaching its own conclusion. Silas Whitcomb sat on his horse, a statue of disbelief, as Delaney's deputies put him in irons. The arrogance that had been his armor for decades had shattered, leaving only a bewildered, furious old man. "You can't do this, Delaney!" he raged, his voice thin and reedy against the roar of the liberated creek. "I'll see you ruined. I'll have your badge. I own the judge." "Not this one. You don't," Delaney said, his tired face grimly satisfied. He held up the tin box for all to see. "These are federal warrants. The judge who signed them is on his way from Prescott." He turned to the crowd of ranchers, who were watching, their faces a mixture of awe and dawning hope. "Silas Whitcomb is in federal custody, charged with conspiracy, corruption, and the theft of public water." As if on cue, Whitcomb made one last desperate play. "Wait," he said, his voice suddenly conspiratorial. "Delaney, be reasonable. The Mid-Spar Reservoir. It's worth millions. A man like you. A man with your authority. You could be a partner. 10%. Just lose that box." The ranchers gasped. Finola Dade spat on the ground. Delaney looked at Whitcomb with an expression of pure, unadulterated contempt. He didn't even bother to reply. He simply turned Whitcomb over to his deputies. The public humiliation of the bribe attempted a more potent punishment than any words. Standing by the edge of the newly formed river, Thomas Vale watched the water pour past. It was clear and cold and beautiful, and it was flowing back into Rook Fork Creek for the first time in years. He thought of his own small, parched plot of land downstream. He thought of his children, who had never known the creek to be anything but a dry, dusty ditch. He put a hand to his face, and tears, hot and cleansing, flowed freely down his cheeks, mingling with the spray from the water of his reclaimed home. At the base of the tower, Eli was waiting. He watched as Delaney brought a cuffed and defeated Pike Mallory down the ladder. He watched as Ada descended, her face calm, her movements steady. She stepped off the last rung and her eyes found his. He took a step toward her, and in the bright, clean light of the morning, she saw that his hand, the one that had held the Spencer so steadily, was trembling. Not from fear, but from the crashing wave of adrenaline, the release of 2 years of pent-up grief and anger, the sheer, overwhelming cost of the fight. She said nothing. She simply walked to him and took his shaking hand in both of hers. Her hands were cool, steady, and impossibly strong. She held his hand until the trembling stopped, her calm presence a silent anchor in the emotional storm. He looked down at their joined hands, then up at her face, his eyes filled with a raw, unspoken gratitude. Ada looked past him, at the flowing water, at the cheering ranchers, at the dawn of a new day for the basin. Then she looked back at him, a soft, playful light returning to her eyes. "Tonight," she whispered, her voice a low, intimate murmur meant only for him, a gentle tease and a solemn promise all in one. "You're still sleeping on my side." Eli didn't move. He didn't shift his weight or look away. A slow smile, the first true, unguarded smile of his life, touched his lips. The cold, desolate emptiness in his eyes was gone, replaced by a deep, quiet, and abiding warmth. The stones were gone. The blanket was warm. The camera of the mind pulls back, rising high into the morning sky. Below, the scene unfolds like a living map. The liberated water of Rook Fork Creek surges through the gulch, a silver ribbon of life returning to the parched land. The massive windmill turns, slow and steady now, its blades catching the clean morning light, a symbol of a life restored. The people of the basin, their faces bright with a hope they had forgotten existed, celebrate on the banks of their returned river. The sound of their cheering rises, mingling with the roar of the water and the groan of the turning windmill. The view pulls back further and further, until the individual figures blur. But one image remains sharp, the emotional heart of the epic scene. Two people, standing at the foot of the tower, their hands tightly clasped, a small, unbreakable point of stillness in the heart of the beautiful, chaotic, and now living world. The blades of the windmill cut across the wide, blue, desert sky, and the story cuts to black, leaving the audience in the ringing silence, in the profound afterglow of freedom, justice, and a love that was not found, but forged. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey through the Red Kestrel Basin. We'd love to know where you're listening from, so please drop a comment below to share your thoughts and connect with fellow fans. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. For extra support, please hit that hype button to help this story reach more listeners just like you.